Hey guys, tonight we're walking straight into one of the most brilliantly vicious political character assassinations in European history, the systematic, printed, illustrated and entirely fabricated destruction of Marie Antoinette, a woman who was handed to France at age 14 and then slowly buried alive under pamphlets. Not the Sofia Coppola version, not the powdered confection draped in pastel, the real one. The one involving chamber pots behind tapestries, hair towers requiring structurally modified carriages, and a pornography industry so sophisticated it had international distribution before France had running water. If you're one of the people who suggested this one, thank you, genuinely, and I hope you're somewhere comfortable, because this story gets heavy. If you enjoy what I do here, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually want more of this kind of quietly devastating historical content. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it's for you. It's always somehow 2 a.m. somewhere, and tonight that feels particularly appropriate. Dim the lights, turn on a fan for some soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe pull the blanket up a little tighter, because we're about to step inside a world where the most dangerous thing wasn't the guillotine, it was the printing press. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to arrive in a foreign country at 14, stripped of every single thing you owned, including your dog, and handed to a stranger in front of a crowd? Why did the most powerful court in Europe lack functioning toilets, but somehow find the budget for a 3-foot hair tower incorporating a working model of a naval frigate? Could you survive a marriage that went nowhere for 7 years, while an entire continent quietly took notes? What exactly was happening in the Grove of Venus at night, and why did a cardinal think a stranger handing him a rose in the dark was a sign from the Queen? How do you run a pamphlet empire out of Amsterdam and Switzerland when the content is so illegal it gets burned in public? And why did it keep selling? Did anyone, at any point, think to ask whether any of this was true? And what does it mean that a lock of hair and a piece of lab equipment in the year 2000 quietly proved the whole thing wrong? Congratulations, you've just woken up in Versailles, 1770, a palace with 1,700 rooms, no plumbing, and a kingdom's worth of opinions about what you're doing wrong. Your dog is gone. Your name is technically still yours, but only just. Good luck. You're 14, and you're standing in a wooden pavilion on a small island in the Rhine, waiting to be processed. The Habsburg attendants who raised you're removing your clothing one item at a time, in a specific order, while a parallel team of French attendants waits behind a velvet rope to dress you in French clothes the moment the Austrian ones come off. Your books are confiscated. Your jewellery is confiscated. Your maids are confiscated. Your dog is confiscated. You arrived as Marie Antoinette. You will leave as Marie Antoinette. The island has a name, the Ile des Épées, and a purpose, which is to be a buffer zone between two empires conducting a transaction. You're the transaction. The wooden pavilion was built specifically for this exchange, which is the diplomatic equivalent of an airport arrivals hall, except the luggage they're checking is you, and the customs declaration requires that nothing Austrian survives the crossing. Not the language, not the clothes, not the spaniel. The dog doesn't get an explanation. You're the 15th child of Holy Roman Emperor Francis I and Empress Maria Theresa, which sounds impressive until you calculate how far down the inheritance list that places you. Far enough down that marry off to the Bourbons was always the plan. Your mother has been negotiating this since you were in primary school, which you were still effectively in when the negotiations concluded. The groom is Louis Auguste, age 15. Neither of you has been asked. 24 hours after you cross the Rhine, you'll be married in front of roughly 5,000 courtiers at Versailles, which is basically a Beyoncé stadium show, except the headliner is a political alliance, and the audience's job is to evaluate your posture. The ceremony will last most of the day. You won't have eaten much. The groom will fall asleep during the fireworks. Nobody thinks this is a bad sign. The pavilion ceremony takes hours. The French ladies on the other side of the velvet rope are ranking themselves by title while they wait, because in France the rank of who hands you a garment is as important as the garment itself. They've rehearsed this. You haven't rehearsed anything, because nobody told you there was a rehearsal, because the assumption was that you would simply arrive and be correct. Your mother, Empress Maria Theresa, did write you letters. Long, detailed letters about posture, piety, and not playing cards past midnight. She sent them via Ambassador Marie Antoinette, who kept copies of everything, which is very much the original chain of custody email thread. The letters didn't mention the dog. By the time the last Austrian garment comes off and the first French one goes on, you're someone else's problem in the most official possible sense. The Habsburg ladies curtsy and withdraw. The French ladies curtsy and advance. A woman whose title outranks every other woman present steps forward with the chemise. You stand there, 14 years old. The Rhine is outside. Your dog is somewhere behind you. On the Austrian side, which is now technically a foreign country, the carriage to Versailles is already waiting. It's a very nice carriage. Nobody in it's someone you've ever met before today. You marry Louis Auguste in the royal chapel at Versailles the day after you arrive, and approximately 5,000 courtiers attend. They aren't there as guests in any sense you'd recognise. They're there because court protocol entitles them to attend, because attending is how they prove they still exist within the social geometry of the palace, and because watching the ceremony is one of their only forms of public visibility. You have stopped playing with dolls in the recent past. The Dauphin is 16. Neither of you has been told what to do tonight. The chapel is gilded to a degree that stops being beautiful and starts being a medical condition. Candles everywhere, 5,000 bodies generating heat and perfume, and the particular anxiety of people who've been standing in formal shoes for 3 hours, some of which were borrowed. Outside it's raining. There's thunder. Some courtiers decide this is a bad omen. Some decide it isn't. Nobody asks you. The wedding night is attended too, not by 5,000, only by the immediate family and select officials, but attended. The bedding ceremony requires witnesses. The bed is blessed. The Dauphin climbs in. You climb in. Everyone files out. In the morning, Louis writes a single word in his diary. Rien. Nothing. Which is either an entry about the hunting, or it isn't, and historians have been arguing about it ever since. The diary has one word. The historians have filled libraries. Nothing happens for 7 years. This is not a metaphor. The marriage remains unconsummated from 1770 to 1777, which is roughly the length of a doctoral programme. Except at the end of a doctoral programme, you have something to show for it. The reason is disputed. There's a medical explanation involving Louis' anatomy, a psychological explanation involving Louis' temperament, and a third explanation which is that nobody adequately explained the situation to either party. All three may be true simultaneously. The royal court of France, home to 10,000 people, and more gossip than a Real Housewives reunion, somehow fails to brief its heir apparent on the relevant information. Your mother notices. Maria Theresa, Holy Roman Empress, mother of 15, woman who ran an empire while giving birth to it, starts writing letters. They arrive via the Ambassador Marie Antoinette, who functions as a one-man diplomatic surveillance operation reporting your behaviour back to Vienna in exhaustive detail. The letters are preserved in the Haus Hof und Staatsarchiv. They cover spending, gambling, favourites, late nights, and the absence of an heir. Maria Theresa's correspondence style is less warm maternal guidance and more quarterly performance review with consequences. By 1777, the situation is urgent enough that your brother Joseph II makes a personal visit. He comes incognito as Count Falkenstein, which is the 18th century equivalent of a celebrity wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap and expecting nobody to notice. He sits down with both of you separately and has frank conversations. Afterward, he writes to your other brother Leopold that Louis would, and this is paraphrased only slightly, penetrate modestly and then fall asleep. Joseph's letter is specific in its disappointment. It reads like a contractor's report on a renovation that hasn't started. The intervention works. Marie-Thérèse Charlotte is born December 19th, 1778. The court celebrates. France celebrates. Your mother writes another letter. It's still a performance review. What nobody records carefully is what the 7 years cost you. Not politically, not dynastically, but in the daily social arithmetic of a palace that's watching. Every year without a pregnancy is a year the court whispers. Every whisper is a theory. The theories will eventually find their way into print, and once they're in print, they stop being theories. They become the version of you that travels. You wait for something to happen in the marital bed, and for 7 years, nothing does. The Dauphin attempts the formal motions occasionally, falls asleep at predictable intervals, and the next morning the household physicians and the Austrian ambassador and your mother in Vienna all want to know what didn't happen and why. The medical theory is a tight foreskin requiring minor surgery. The behavioral theory is that nobody has explained the relevant mechanics. The diplomatic consequence is the same in either case. The succession requires an heir. You're the failure point. Your mother writes from Vienna. The letters arrive via the Austrian ambassador, Mercy Argentor, who is also reporting everything you do back to your mother, which is basically having your mum read your texts, while also being your therapist. Maria Therese's letters are frank in the way that only a woman who raised 16 children can be frank. She warns about favourites. She warns about gambling. She warns about the company of men who are not your husband. She doesn't appear to consider this ironic, given the man she's chosen for you. The letters are preserved in Vienna's house, Hof- und Staatsarchiv. Every note, every maternal instruction, every gentle correction of a daughter whose marriage isn't working and whose country isn't hers. The archive has them all. It's the most documented nagging in European history. Meanwhile, the situation at Versailles doesn't improve on its own. April 1777, your brother Joseph II arrives incognito as Count Falkenstein, which is the 18th century equivalent of showing up in a fake moustache, except he's the Holy Roman Emperor, and everyone already knows. He speaks frankly to both of you, separately, and then writes to his brother Leopold, with the kind of clinical honesty that only brothers can sustain. The letter describes Louis penetrating modestly, falling asleep, and not finishing. This is a diplomatic document. It's in the official record. Someone filed it. Joseph's visit works, which says something about the value of plain conversation in royal marriages, though nobody involved seems to have drawn the obvious lesson. By December 1778, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte is born. The household celebrates. The ambassador writes Vienna. Your mother, who has been writing increasingly agitated letters for 7 years, receives the news and presumably sets down her pen for 5 minutes. The pregnancy doesn't quiet the whispers. It amplifies them. 7 years of waiting has given the court and the pamphlet writers a full library of speculation to work with, and speculation doesn't stop just because the facts arrive to contradict it. If anything, the facts make things more complicated. The Queen has a child after 7 years of nothing. The question that circulates in the wine-stained back rooms of Paris isn't whether the child exists. It's whose child it's. You didn't start the rumour. You couldn't have stopped it. The failure point years left too much space, and space in Versailles fills with something whether you want it to or not. Usually gossip. Sometimes worse, you receive your older brother in 1777, travelling under a false name. Joseph II of Austria has registered at his hotel as Count Falkenstein, which is the diplomatic version of arriving at your problem dressed as an interested neighbour. He spends several weeks at Versailles, has frank conversations with you and with Louis separately, and writes home to your other brother in language that will eventually survive in archival form. The summary: Louis penetrates modestly, falls asleep, and doesn't finish. The recommendation? Minor surgery. The marriage is consummated within months. Your brother's vacation produces an heir. Joseph doesn't sugarcoat. The letter to Leopold runs to several pages and reads less like a diplomatic dispatch and more like a plumber, explaining what he found behind your walls. He notes that Louis has all the necessary equipment and absolutely no idea what to do with it, which is the kind of diagnosis that would have been mortifying in any century and lands especially hard when it's being committed to parchment by the Holy Roman Emperor for future archivists to find. The letter survives. It always survives. Louis, for his part, appears to have taken the conversation seriously. The surgery, minor, corrective, happens. The results are conclusive. Marie Therese Charlotte arrives December 19th, 1778. The court celebrates. Then it immediately pivots, because a 7-year wait has generated a considerable amount of speculation. And speculation doesn't stop just because the answer arrives. The pamphlet writers have spent years developing alternate theories, and alternate theories don't refund themselves. They need somewhere to go. The question shifts from why nowhere to whose heir, actually, and the libelles, which have been warming up in the Netherlands and London and various damp Swiss printing rooms, consider this a reasonable follow-up question worth exploring in illustrated form. The illustrated form isn't tasteful. It's basically the comment section of early modern Europe, except printed and smuggled in false-bottomed trunks across 3 borders, which is essentially what you'd get if Reddit threads were physically trafficked by men in cloaks. The pamphleteers name candidates. They name Fersen. They name the Comte d'Artois. They name anyone who has ever stood near the Queen at a reception and made eye contact. The accusations aren't really about sex. They're about legitimacy. A queen who produces an heir through someone other than the king produces an heir who has no right to the throne, which means the throne is available. Which is the point. You don't see most of these pamphlets directly. They don't arrive on silver trays. But you know they exist. Marie Antoinette knows they exist. Your mother in Vienna knows they exist and mentions them in her letters alongside instructions about not gambling and wearing warmer stockings. Maria Theresa has opinions about everything, delivered by diplomatic post, and people are saying terrible things about you in print lands between your posture at dinner and the ambassador says your spending is out of control. The letters are archived in Vienna. They also always survive. Joseph departs Versailles having accomplished more in 6 weeks than 7 years of anxious maternal correspondence managed. He is practical, unsentimental, and apparently willing to have a conversation with a king about minor surgery that nobody else in France would touch with a 10-foot ceremonial staff. He gets results. What he can't fix is the gap those 7 years have already opened. The pamphlets have been in circulation long enough to feel like history. By the time the heir arrives, the story is already written. The author isn't taking corrections. Your mother writes regularly, and the letters arrive through Ambassador Marie Antoinette, who functions as a diplomatic mailman with editorial opinions. Maria Theresa wants to know about your spending, your card games, your religious observance, your friendships, your proximity to the king's bed, and the political positions of every minister you've recently spoken to. The replies are also routed through Marie Antoinette, who reads them, comments on them, and occasionally adjusts the tone before forwarding the substance to Vienna. The correspondence is intimate. It's also surveilled. Your mother is the empress and the supervisor. Maria Theresa has been running this particular operation since before you arrived in France. Marie Antoinette files his own reports separately, detailed, candid, occasionally unflattering, which the Empress reads alongside your letters and cross-references for discrepancies. It's basically a performance review system, except the reviews arrive on horseback, and your manager is also the woman who gave birth to you and also controls Central Europe. The letters themselves are specific. Not be careful with money, but I am told you spent 14,000 livres on a single month of card games. Not be kind to the king, but frank, clinical assessments of what a wife's obligations are and what happens to queens who fail to produce heirs on schedule. Maria Theresa's instructions arrive on schedule, a woman who raised 16 children and considers nagging a precision instrument, and she has very few illusions. She doesn't traffic in vague encouragement. She traffics in directives, and she doesn't approve of Madame du Barry. Du Barry is Louis XV's official mistress, the previous king's favourite, and a woman the Empress considers beneath acknowledgement. You agree with your mother on this point, possibly the only point, and spend 2 years at Versailles refusing to speak to du Barry in public. The Versailles court watches this the way people watch a reality show elimination, which is to say obsessively and with sides already chosen. Eventually your mother instructs you, plainly, to say something. Anything. One sentence. You say, "There are many people at Versailles today," and the court treats it like a diplomatic breakthrough. Du Barry reportedly receives this as a significant thaw. Your mother receives it as barely sufficient. The letters continue after Louis XV dies in 1774 and you become queen. They shift in tone, less about du Barry, more about the spending, the gambling debts, the late nights at masked balls, the card tables at the Petit Trianon running until 4 in the morning while the servants wait. Mercy Argentos' parallel reports confirm every detail. He notes, not unkindly, that the Queen seems to find in her circle of favourites the ease she can't find in formal court life. He writes this as an observation. He means it as a warning. Your mother dies in November 1780, which means the letters stop. This is the thing nobody quite accounts for. The surveillance was also the contact. Mercy Argentos reports continue, and your brother Joseph writes occasionally, but there's no longer a weekly letter in your mother's handwriting telling you that you're spending too much and sitting too close to the Comte d'Artois at the card table, and that she has heard about the poof with the ship in it, and she doesn't find it dignified. The criticism arrives, for a while, as a kind of company. Then it doesn't arrive at all. The libelle writers notice the shift. Without an active Habsburg correspondence to misrepresent, they invent one, forged letters attributed to Maria Theresa advising her daughter on how best to extract money from France for Austria's benefit. The letters don't sound like Maria Theresa. They sound like what someone in a Dutch print shop in 1781 imagined an empress might write if the empress were also a villain in a pamphlet. The tone is wrong. The spelling is worse. They circulate. Anyway, you wake up at the time the schedule specifies, and your morning rising, the lever, is conducted in front of approximately a dozen women, whose ranks determine the sequence in which they hand you each item of clothing. The chemise is handed by the highest-ranking lady present. If a higher-ranking lady arrives mid-ceremony, the chemise must be physically passed up the rank ladder before it reaches you. You stand naked while this happens. The room temperature is whatever it is. The ceremony ends when it ends. Your participation in your own clothing is largely ceremonial. The chemise handoff isn't a ceremony about dressing. It's a ceremony about rank, performed at your expense, in which your body is the stage set. A duchess of higher precedence arrives late, and the chemise, already in a lesser lady's hands, already extended toward you, gets pulled back, passed sideways, passed again. You wait. You're still naked. The fire across the room isn't near enough. Your skin is covered in goosebumps, which isn't part of the ritual but happens anyway, because physics doesn't consult the protocol. This is where the account from the Comtesse de Boigny becomes specific. She records an incident where Marie Antoinette stood shivering for several minutes while 2 ladies argued the precedence question. The Queen laughed. What else do you do? You've been trained since childhood that rank governs everything, and you're currently living inside the proof of that. The Princess de Chimay arrives late, breathless, takes the chemise from the lower-ranking lady's hands without making eye contact, and presents it to you as if she's been carrying it the whole time. Nobody corrects her. The lower-ranking lady looks at a wall. The lever runs roughly an hour. You don't select your own clothes. Rose Bertain, your dressmaker, who's basically the Anna Wintour of Versailles, except she holds no official title and runs the entire operation through force of personality, sends the book of fabric samples each week. You point, she decides. A single court gown costs 10,000 livres, which is 3 years of a skilled craftsman's wages, which is a number that appears in libelles every time someone needs to make a point about you. The point lands. It keeps landing. By the early 1780s, your annual clothing budget exceeds 120,000 livres. The Treasury is managing a debt crisis partly inherited from 2 wars and partly from the interest on those wars' loans. None of that is your dress budget's fault. None of that stops the math from looking the way it looks on a pamphlet. Rose Bertin's poufs deserve a separate paragraph because they're structurally remarkable. 3 feet tall, sometimes more. She incorporates ships, model ones, rigged with thread and bird cages, and pastoral scenes with tiny papier-mâché sheep. The hair is built up over a wire armature and powdered white. It requires a carriage with a specially cut-down roof, which is basically a Met Gala situation except you wore it to dinner on a Tuesday and your neck ached for 3 days afterward. The pouf, commemorating the French naval victory at the Battle of Belle Isle, includes a working model of the frigate. It's on your head. You smile at diplomats. The leather, the gown, the pouf. Smile. This is your morning. The afternoon is public as well. You dine en grand couvert, in public, on a raised platform, while courtiers file past and watch you eat. Not informally, formally. There's a viewing window in the arrangement, which is basically a live streaming setup, except the content is soup and nobody can turn it off. You chew, they watch. Occasionally someone faints from standing too long in the heat. The footmen step around them. The palace at this hour contains somewhere between 8 and 10,000 people. None of the stairwells contain plumbing. The gardens, the famous, meticulously maintained, internationally admired gardens of Versailles, are also, functionally, the toilets. Courtiers relieve themselves behind tapestries, in corners, in the stairwells, between floors. A visitor from England in 1775 notes the smell of the corridors with what can only be described as restrained horror. The Hall of Mirrors is magnificent. The landing outside it is something else entirely. You don't smell it anymore. That's what prolonged residence does. The nose makes accommodations the guidebooks don't mention. You eat dinner at Versailles in winter, and the wine on the side of the table near the windows freezes solid. The fireplaces are too far from the table to do anything about it. The corridor outside has more draughts than walls. Your gown weighs roughly 30 pounds. The fabric is heavily embroidered for visual effect rather than thermal value, and the panniers hold the skirt out from your body in a way that admits cold from every direction. Your shoes are silk. The palace is heated by the assumption that the building will eventually warm up. It doesn't. 10,000 people live in this building. None of them are warm. The fireplaces are enormous and decorative, and produce heat at roughly the efficiency of a single scented candle. The servants are cold. The courtiers are cold. The king is cold. He spends most of his evenings in a locksmithing workshop, in a hidden corridor on a different floor, a hobby, which is the Versailles version of disappearing into the garage, except the garage has tapestries and its own servants, and nobody knows quite which route he takes to get there. The hidden corridors are not a rumour. They're structural. Versailles was built in layers, renovated across 3 reigns, and stitched together with passages that let people move through the palace without crossing public space. Louis uses them. Servants use them. And because they exist, and because the Queen's apartments are where they're, the libelles, the underground pamphlets that are about to define her reputation for 2 centuries, will spend years describing the nightly traffic through those corridors in considerable creative detail. None of it documented, all of it printed. The libelles are basically TMZ if TMZ printed nothing but explicit fan fiction about one specific woman and you could only buy it from a man in an alley in Amsterdam. They're produced in the Netherlands, in Switzerland, in England, anywhere the French crown can't immediately confiscate them, and smuggled back across the border in false-bottomed trunks and mislabelled crates. A Paris bookseller handles distribution. The pamphlets move through lending libraries and reading clubs and hands that don't want to be seen holding them. They sell extremely well. The titles don't bury the premise. Les Amours de Marie Antoinette de 1779 place her in explicit scenes with the Comte d'Artois, who is her brother-in-law. Le Godemiche Royal, which translates to the Royal Dildo, a title that requires no further translation, depicts her with the Princess de Lamballe and the Duchesse de Polignac, two of her closest friends. The Essai historique sur la vie de Marie Antoinette runs to multiple editions and grows longer and more specific with each one, accumulating accusations the way her wardrobe budget accumulated livres. The accusations are fictional. The editions keep coming. None of it needed to be true. That's the point. She's Austrian in a country that doesn't trust Austria. She's expensive in a country going broke. She's private. The Petit Nun admits guests by personal invitation only, which makes perfect sense for someone exhausted by public ritual and makes for excellent paranoid speculation for everyone else. The corridors are real. The pamphlets fill them with invented bodies. The distinction stops mattering somewhere around the third print run. Back at dinner, the candles are doing their best. The soup is warm when it leaves the kitchen, and considerably less warm by the time it travels the distance to the table, which in Versailles is an architectural journey that would require a relay team at a modern catering company. You eat whatever temperature it arrives at. Across from you, someone's glass has a thin skin of ice at the rim. Nobody mentions it. You don't mention it either. Mentioning it would be the kind of remark that gets repeated. You learn quickly that Versailles houses approximately 10,000 people and contains zero indoor plumbing. The architectural solution to this problem is that there's no architectural solution. Chamber pots are emptied into stairwells. Courtiers urinate behind the tapestries closest to whichever room they were in when the need arose. The gardens, which are organized into geometric perfection by André Lenôtre, also serve as the secondary latrine system for several thousand people who can't be expected to walk back inside. The smell is comprehensive. The perfume is functional. Both are operating at full capacity. The chamber pot itself is a piece of furniture with a social life. There's a protocol for who empties it, when, and whether you're expected to acknowledge the process. You're not. A lady in waiting handles the pot with the same expression shed wear, handing you a letter from Vienna, neutral, present, professionally distant. The pot doesn't comment. Neither do you. You've both been here long enough to know how this works. Now, the gardens. Lenôtre designed them to express the rational order of the French crown, which is a little like designing a Whole Foods on top of a composting facility and asking everyone to focus on the produce. The topiaries are immaculate. The fountain basins are mathematically precise. The gravel paths are raked. Somewhere between the Fountain of Latona and the Apollo Basin, a duke is handling personal business behind a hedge that cost 800 livres to maintain. He isn't embarrassed. No one is embarrassed. This is just where 10,000 people go. A footman with a silver tray passes within 12 feet of him. The footman doesn't look. Inside, the stairwells absorb the overflow. This isn't a secret. It's a shared civic arrangement that 10,000 people have silently agreed to never discuss. The tapestries closest to the main corridors have been rinsed so many times they've developed a kind of weathered institutional dignity. Think of them as the Times Square subway station of the Baroque era, except the tiles are Belgian wool and the smell is largely the same. The perfume exists because of all of this. Versailles burns through more scented candles, sachets and pomander balls than any other structure in France, which is saying something given that France in 1780 has committed to fragrance as a core national value. Every morning the Queen's rooms are aired, rescented and reset. By afternoon, the candles are doing what they can. By evening they've given up, and the beeswax is just providing light. What the libelles never mentioned, and they mentioned everything else, is that the secret geography of the palace also served basic logistics. The hidden corridors that pamphleteers imagined as passageways for midnight assignations were mostly used by staff moving chamber pots, firewood, and covered trays between floors without appearing in the formal rooms. A discreet corridor meant someone could empty a pot at 3 a.m. without walking through a salon where a countess was sleeping on a settee because her own apartments were too far away. The palace infrastructure was less like a conspiracy and more like a very large building that hadn't figured out plumbing. The cover-up screen beside your chamber pot is the only private space you reliably have. 2 guards are posted in your room at all times, not for your protection at this point, but for the Republic's. They watch, they wait, they don't turn around for the screen. You go anyway. Privacy is a concept you've renegotiated several times over the past 2 decades, and this is simply the current terms. Outside your window, the concierge's inner courtyard is quiet. The smell here's different, stone and damp, and something that isn't quite mould, but isn't quite not mould either. The perfume stopped being an option a while ago. You don't think about Le Notre Gardens. You don't think about the hedge. Your principal dressmaker is Rose Bertin, and she has become one of the most powerful commoners in France because she has exclusive access to your body. Bertin arrives twice a week with sketches, swatches, and a portable mirror. She is the gatekeeper for which silk merchants get paid, which feather suppliers stay solvent, and which embroiderers receive commissions large enough to expand their workshops. The aristocracy resents her, the merchants court her, and you call her in private the Minister of Fashion. Her actual title is your dressmaker. The distinction has become difficult to maintain. Let's talk about the poufs. Not poufs. Architectural events. Bertin builds them up to 3 feet tall, which is the equivalent of a Met Gala headpiece, except you're wearing it to Tuesday dinner, and your carriage roof has been cut down to accommodate it. Inside the structure, wire scaffolding, horsehair padding, and then the decoration. A model ship, fully rigged. A bird cage with a ribbon bird. A pastoral scene with miniature sheep. Your hair is the landscape. The sheep are not metaphorical. The carriage modification alone costs extra, and nobody mentions the carriage modification. A single court dress runs approximately 10,000 livres. That's 3 years of wages for a skilled craftsman, a clockmaker, a cabinet maker, someone who makes things that last. Your dress lasts 1 season, possibly 2 if Bertin doesn't see you in it again, and quietly suggest a replacement. The dress weighs close to 30 pounds. The panniers at your hips extend far enough that you enter rooms at a slight diagonal, which is the 18th century equivalent of parallel parking, and you do it in full view of 500 courtiers who are taking notes. By the early 1780s, your annual clothing budget has peaked at over 120,000 livres. France is approaching fiscal collapse. These 2 facts are sitting in the same room, and neither of them is leaving. Bertin herself operates like a small logistics company. She runs a boutique on the Rue Saint-Honoré called Au Grand Mogul, not a subtle name, and she maintains a network of suppliers, finishers, and embroiderers across Paris. A dressmaker with your patronage is basically a verified account. Every other client she takes is trading on proximity to you. She knows this. You know this. The aristocracy definitely knows this, which is most of the problem. Bertin's title is not Minister of Fashion. Bertin's title is dressmaker. The job is Minister of Fashion. The distinction has stopped mattering by 1778. Bertin walks the perimeter of you with a length of measuring tape, calls out numbers to a junior assistant who is writing them in a leather book, and at one point pauses, frowns at your shoulder, and says nothing for 40 seconds. The frown is part of the service. The lever ceremony makes the clothing situation structurally stranger. Each morning your ladies hand you your garments in strict order of rank. The highest-ranking woman in the room delivers the next item. A higher-ranking arrival mid-ceremony can remove the chemise from a lower-ranking lady's hands before she passes it. You stand there, sometimes naked, sometimes shivering, while 2 women work out precedence. There's a recorded morning where you stood unclothed long enough that you laughed. Because what else do you do? The chemise eventually arrives. The chemise always eventually arrives. The gowns themselves are a political document nobody meant to publish. A court at Versailles is a display economy. The whole point is visible expenditure, controlled magnificence, everyone dressed to signal their proximity to royal favour. You didn't design this system. You arrived into it at 14, after they took your dog at the Rhine and handed you French clothes before you'd crossed the bridge. But you're the most visible person in the system, which means your spending becomes the face of it when France starts looking for a face to blame. Madame Deficit. That's the name by then. Not Marie Antoinette. Not the Queen. Madame Deficit, wearing a ship in her hair, spending a craftsman's 3-year salary on a dress she'll wear twice. In a palace where the wine freezes near the windows and the courtiers relieve themselves on the stairs. Bertin, for her part, emigrates in 1792 and dies in 1813. She writes no memoirs. She takes the measurements with her. You sit for the poof, and the poof takes hours. The construction begins with your own hair, supplemented with horse hair pads, secured with wire armatures, powdered to a uniform white, and then ornamented with whatever the day's theme requires. Today the theme is naval victory, so the poof contains a model frigate at full rigging 3 feet above the top of your skull. The carriages have been re-engineered with cut-down roofs to accommodate this. You cannot recline. You cannot pass through ordinary doorways. You cannot scratch your scalp. Sleeping requires planning. The frigate isn't the strangest thing that's gone up there. Bertin has done bird cages, functional ones, with actual birds. She's done pastoral scenes, tiny ceramic sheep, a miniature shepherd, a lamb the size of a walnut. The lamb is the size of a walnut, the sheep are roughly the size of dice, and a junior milliner has been credited with the project in a letter Bertin clearly didn't proofread. She's done a garden in full bloom, elevated 18 inches above your forehead, with silk flowers wired into their positions so they don't shed petals during the entremets. The pouf is basically a Met Gala headpiece, except you wear it to dinner on a Tuesday and can't sit upright in your carriage on the way home. By the early 1780s, the tallest constructions are reaching 3 feet. That's not a hairdo. That's load-bearing architecture. Nobody outside the court fully understands the construction process, which means the pamphlets will invent one. The libelles, those underground printed sheets smuggled in from Amsterdam, Geneva and London, have a great deal to say about the Queen's hair, her wardrobe, her appetites and her bedroom arrangements, in roughly that order of escalating specificity. They're basically TMZ, except the content is explicit political fiction. You can only buy a copy from a man in a basement near the Palais Royal, and the subject has no publicist and no legal recourse. The presses run continuously. The editions multiply. Each new one adds details the previous one was too tasteful to include, which sets a very low bar. A pamphlet from 1779 pairs her with the Comte d'Artois, her husband's younger brother, in scenes that require no description here and didn't require much imagination there. Another, titled with a directness that would make a modern content moderator quit on the spot, depicts her with the Princess de Lamballe and the Duchess of Polignac in arrangements that are less about political critique and more about whatever the printer thought would sell fastest near the Seine. Both circulate widely. Both are reprinted. Neither contains a single documented fact. The women named alongside her are her actual friends. Lambert is gentle and anxious, prone to fainting at card games and unpleasant dinner conversations. Polignac is warm, expensive, and politically radioactive. Her family extracts somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000 livres annually from the royal treasury, which the libelles won't mention because financial nuance doesn't move copies the way illustrations do. The Queen's friendships are close. In a court where every relationship is also a transaction, closeness reads as suspicious. The pamphlets treat suspicion as confirmation. The powdering takes another hour. A servant holds a cone over your face so the white powder coats the hair without coating your eyes. your mouth, your lungs. The cone is made of stiff paper. It fits over your nose like a small domestic chimney. You breathe shallowly. The powder settles. When it's done, the frigate sits perfectly level at full mast, and you look like someone who has made a series of choices that can't be undone before dinner. The thing about the poufs is that they're visible. You can see them across a room, above a crowd, through a doorway. You can see them from the courtyard. The libelle reader in Paris can't see Versailles, but they've heard about the hair. 3 feet of horsehair and silk and miniature naval vessels funded by a treasury that can't balance its books. The pouf is the argument made physical. You didn't design it as a symbol. Bertin designed it as fashion. The distinction stops mattering sometime around 1783. You can't scratch your scalp. You've mentioned this. It stays relevant. Your annual clothing budget passes 120,000 livres in the early 1780s, and the people who calculate these figures have done the math against other line items in the kingdom's books. A single court gown costs 10,000 livres, which is 3 years of a skilled craftsman's wages. Hentematol ere torrent tu exifio as fenimogoroth, with the all the magistenadores. The Treasury is running a deficit, measurable in 9 figures, mostly from supporting an American war you have nothing to do with. The deficit nevertheless attaches itself to your dress allowance in the public imagination. The math doesn't support the attribution. The pamphlets don't require math. The gown itself is a structural project. A full court ensemble with panniers, the side hoops that make you approximately 5 feet wide at the hip, weighs somewhere between 25 and 30 pounds. You don't walk in it so much as navigate. Doorways require a sideways approach. Carriages require advanced planning. The fabric is silk brocade usually, with embroidered trim, and the embroidery alone takes months. Rose Bertin charges accordingly. She doesn't apologize for the invoice. Bertin isn't a seamstress. She's a minister. She holds no official title, but she arrives at your apartments with fabric samples and strong opinions about what Austria-born queens should be wearing in France, and nobody stops her at the door. She's basically the Anna Wintour of the Ancien Régime, except her clients didn't choose to be on the cover. The panniers go on first, then the stays, boned, laced from behind, tightened by a lady who has been doing this for years and feels no obligation to be gentle. Then the petticoat. Then the gown, which requires 2 people to hold level while a third fastens the back. By the time you're dressed, 3 separate women have touched your body with a professional detachment of airport security. The process takes well over an hour. None of it's comfortable. Nobody says it's uncomfortable, by 2. And then there's the budget. The 120,000 livres is the number that circulates in print, but it doesn't include shoes, which are separate, or jewels, which are separate, or the gambling debts from the card tables at Versailles, which nobody officially counts but everyone privately tracks. The Duchess of Polignac's family extracts somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000 livres annually from the royal treasury through pensions and appointments. Nobody writes pamphlets about the Duchess of Polignac. You're the one with the recognizable face on the cover. Madame Deficit. That's the name that sticks. It appears in print in the mid-1780s and doesn't leave. It's a useful name because it does 2 things at once. It collapses the entire French fiscal crisis onto one woman's spending habits, and it lets the actual architects of the deficit continue their work undisturbed. Turgot is gone. Necker is gone. The Treasury's structural problems long predate your wardrobe. None of that fits on a pamphlet cover. The clothing budget peaks, and then, quietly, you cut it. By the late 1780s, you're wearing simpler muslin gowns at the Petit Trianon, which becomes its own problem. The libelles describe the simplicity as evidence of rural debauchery. The excess was evidence of aristocratic contempt. Whatever you wear, the caption is already written. A court dress from this period still exists in various museum collections. The Palais Galliera has fragments. The Met has examples from the era. You can look at the embroidery under glass and understand, in a sensory way that no pamphlet conveys, how much labour went into a thing that was worn twice and then retired to the wardrobe. The stitching is extremely fine. The craftsman who did it earned, in a good year, about 3,000 livres. The gown cost more than 3 of him. You don't read the pamphlets that describe your sex life, but the pamphlets exist regardless. They're produced in Amsterdam, in Geneva, in London, and in unauthorized print shops in the Palais Royal that get raided semi-regularly without ever being closed. The smuggling routes run on river barges, in the false bottoms of merchants' wagons, and through the diplomatic post when an enterprising consul is willing to overlook the contents. The booksellers who distribute them have been arrested, fined, and released enough times that the arrests function as a form of business expense. The supply continues. The genre has a name, libelles, from the Latin for little book, which is doing a lot of heavy lifting as a description. They're not political essays. They're not satire in any measured sense. They're explicit, specific, and detailed in ways that suggest intimate knowledge and reflect none whatsoever. The authors are anonymous. The publishers are technically foreign. The moment one edition gets seized, 3 more appear, with slightly different covers and the same interior. Let's talk about what's in them. Les Amours de Charlotte Antoinette, circulating from 1779, places you in explicit scenes with the Comte d'Artois, your husband's younger brother, and is illustrated. Le Godemiché Royal, which translates without euphemism as the royal dildo, depicts you in lesbian scenes with the Princess de Lamballe and the Duchesse de Polignac, 2 women you actually know and actually like, which is the specific cruelty of the detail. The Essai historique sur la vie de Marie Antoinette runs to multiple editions and functions as a cumulative charge sheet, updated periodically as your political situation deteriorates. It's basically a Wikipedia edit war, except the editors are anonymous pamphleteers and every edit makes you worse. The Palais Royal is doing significant work in this economy. The Duke of Orleans, your husband's cousin, a man with political ambitions of his own, owns the complex and declines to enforce royal censorship inside it. Booksellers operate openly in the arcades. You can buy a libelle 50 yards from men selling cheese and ribbon. The cheese sellers don't get raided. Neither, functionally, do the booksellers. A single pamphlet costs a few sous. A craftsman earns maybe 30 sous a day. The math works out to something the average Parisian can afford, which is the point. Your clothing budget, your hair, your spending, these are abstract numbers. A pamphlet is a physical object you can hold and read aloud in a tavern. The crowd doesn't need to see Versailles to have an opinion about what happens there. The pamphlet provides the opinion preformed. The distribution network runs like a postal system that's embarrassed about itself. Packages travel under false labels, devotional texts, commercial correspondence, cloth samples. The Lyon road customs official accepts the paperwork. The merchant nods. The wagon proceeds. The wagon contains 40 copies of a pamphlet describing the Queen's encounters in graphic detail. The customs official will eat dinner that night without thinking about any of this. None of the authors are ever identified with certainty. Some historians attribute specific libelles to journalists in Grub Street, London, the original content farm, paid by the word, no fact-checking department. Some come from émigrés with grievances. Some come from people who simply found that this particular subject moved product. The motivation varies. The output is consistent. What ties them together isn't the accusations. Those shift and contradict and occasionally cancel each other out across editions. What ties them together is you. The name L'Autrichienne appears on nearly every cover. The pun is always present, always deliberate. Moi. Autrichienne. Austrian woman. The chien buried inside it means female dog. The pamphlets don't need to agree on what you've done. They only need to agree on what you're... You appear in pamphlets with specific titles, in specific scenarios, with specific named co-conspirators. There's Les Amours de Charlotte Antoinette, in which you sleep with your husband's brother. There's Essai historique sur la vie de Marie Antoinette, which has gone through 15 editions, each more graphic than the last. There's Le Godemiché Royal, literally, the royal dildo, a title chosen with the directness of someone aiming for clarity over taste, in which you sleep with two of your closest female friends. The pamphlets contradict each other constantly, which doesn't slow them down. The reader isn't asked to choose. The reader is asked to keep buying. Les Amours de Charlotte et Toinette arrives first, in 1779. The Comte d'Artois, your brother-in-law, a man you have spoken to at dinner approximately 400 times, is your listed co-star. The text is detailed. It's illustrated. It has a prose style that sits somewhere between a legal deposition and a fever dream. Nobody credible has ever connected you romantically to the Comte d'Artois. The pamphlet doesn't cite sources because it doesn't have any. It has momentum instead, which turns out to be sufficient. The essai historique is the long game. It's basically the Wikipedia article version of the libelle format, updated continuously, expanded with each print run, circulated from Paris to the Netherlands, to London and back. By its 15th edition, it has accumulated accusations that contradict accusations from its 3rd edition. You have too many lovers. You have no lovers and are exclusively interested in women. You spend all day gambling. You spend all day in bed. The reader doesn't notice the contradictions because the reader isn't reading for accuracy. The reader is reading the way people scroll through celebrity gossip on Reddit at midnight. The narrative is the product. The facts are decoration. Le Godemiché Royal names the Princess de Lamballe and the Duchess of Polignac. Both women are your actual close friends, which is the one factual detail the pamphlet contains. It uses that detail as an anchor and builds outward from there into territory that has no relationship to any recorded event in any room you have ever occupied. The Duchess of Polignac is costing the Treasury somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000 livres a year in pensions and appointments for her family. That part is true. The pamphlet doesn't mention it. The pamphlet has other priorities. What links all three isn't the content. It's the structure. Each one places you at the centre. Each one gives you desires that are excessive, foreign and ungovernable. Each one implies that if you could behave like this in private, you could betray anything in public. The leap from bedroom to treasury to throne is short, and the pamphlets make it in every edition. You're not just immoral, you're a threat. The authors are not named. Some are hired pamphleteers working for a daily rate. Some are political operators with specific agendas and specific enemies. Some are simply people who discovered that a scandalous pamphlet about the Queen sold faster than anything else they could print, which is basically the discovery that drives modern tabloid economics. The Daily Mail figured out the same thing in the 20th century and has never looked back. The product is deniable, shareable, and nearly impossible to suppress once it's in circulation. You try suppression anyway. The police confiscate shipments. Booksellers are arrested. The pamphlets are burned in small ceremonial quantities that have no measurable effect on distribution. One seized copy becomes a rumour. The rumour sells 10 more copies. Suppression is good marketing, which the publishers understand, and your ministers apparently don't. The accusations are fiction. That part matters, and it doesn't matter at all. By 1789, the essai historique is cheap enough that a laundress can afford it. It's been in print for a decade. The version of you that lives in it has had 10 years to become the real one. You acquire 2 nicknames that move through Paris faster than any official document. Madame Deficit attaches itself to your spending, which is real but smaller than the total deficit by an order of magnitude. Le Chrétien attaches itself to your origin, with the second half of the word working as a quiet pun on chienne, which means female dog, and which is what people are actually calling you in private. The names show up on tavern walls. They show up in song lyrics. They show up in pamphlets that don't otherwise mention you by full name. They don't need to. The Madame Deficit nickname lands around 1787, when France's debt crisis has become impossible to ignore, and someone needs to carry it. Your clothing budget peaked at 120,000 livres in the early 1780s, which is genuinely a lot. France's total debt by that point is somewhere in the range of 4 billion livres, which is genuinely more. The math doesn't matter. The name travels faster than the math, which is basically how Twitter works, except it's 1787 and the medium is a song you overhear in a fish market. Le Chrétien is older and nastier. It's been in quiet circulation since the 1770s, and it does two things simultaneously. Marks you as foreign and marks you as something worse. Austrian, chien. The two syllables at the end don't need to be pointed out to a French ear, the second half of the word doing the work, quietly, the way a knife does work in a kitchen. They're just there, tucked into a polite-sounding word, doing their work, at the exact register where plausible deniability lives. The names don't replace you. The Gäseballpomink. They replace the process of thinking about you. A pamphlet with a specific title requires you to read it, evaluate it, decide whether to believe it. A nickname requires nothing. You already know what Madame Deficit means by the time someone says it. You've absorbed the whole argument before the second syllable. This is basically the entire business model of a cable news chyron, and it worked in 1787 for the same reason it works now. The Petit Trianon feeds both names simultaneously. You've retreated there for privacy, entry by personal invitation only, which is a reasonable preference for a woman who can't cross a room without 16 people watching. The public reads it differently. The gardens that nobody can enter are obviously hiding something. The parties that nobody describes are obviously depraved. The Hameau de la Reine, your small model farm, built in 1783 for roughly 158,000 livres, becomes proof of a woman playing at poverty while the actual poor starve. A shepherd hired to look picturesque wanders the grounds. He doesn't know he's a political liability. He's just holding a crook and looking pastoral. A lampoon songwriter in 1788 doesn't need to specify which parties happened at the Trianon. He just needs to mention the Trianon. The name carries the rest. The Polignac circle makes it worse. The Duchess of Polignac has extracted somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000 livres annually from the royal treasury through her various positions and pensions, which is an impressive total for a woman whose primary qualification was being enjoyable company. You're fond of her. The pamphlets are fonder still. She appears in Le Godemiche Royal by name, which is the kind of literary immortality nobody asks for. Her presence in your orbit gets read as evidence of a woman who selects favourites for personal reasons, which isn't entirely wrong, and for sexual ones, which isn't supported by anything except the pamphlets, which aren't supported by anything at all. The Princess de Lamballe is the other name that keeps appearing. She's your superintendent of the household, your closest companion, and she appears in the libelles alongside Polignac in scenarios invented wholesale. The pamphlets don't distinguish between women you're fond of and women you're allegedly sleeping with. Fondness is evidence. Closeness is confession. None of this is adjudicated. There's no mechanism for that. You can't sue a pamphlet printed in Amsterdam and smuggled in a false-bottom trunk. You can burn the copies you confiscate and fund the suppression orders and watch circulation rise anyway. The nickname is already on the tavern wall. The pamphlet is already in the 3rd edition. The shepherd is still standing in the garden, holding his crook, completely unaware that he's a symbol. You meet Axel von Fersen the Younger at a masquerade ball in Paris in January 1774, and you don't know yet that he's going to matter. He's 19, you're 18, he's Swedish, he's unmistakably handsome in the specific way. Northern military officers are handsome, and he's wearing a costume that doesn't disguise anything important. You speak briefly. He doesn't realize at first that you're the Dauphiné. The court records this conversation as one of dozens that night. Several decades later, the conversation will still be the most romantically documented thing in your life. Fersen leaves France shortly after. Military service, the American Revolutionary War, the general business of being an ambitious Swedish aristocrat with options. He returns in 1783 and takes apartments near Versailles, which is a specific choice. You're queen now. You have 3 children, a husband who retreats to his locksmithing workshop, and a reputation that's been running ahead of you in pamphlet form for several years. Fersen's arrival is noted. The court notes everything, then files it next to everything else it has noted, in a room full of things nobody talks about directly. Let's talk about what exists now and what existed then. What exists now is Fersen's diary, partially. What existed then was more diary, more letters, more something. His niece Charlotte de Koskull spent a meaningful portion of her adult life with a bottle of ink and a paintbrush, blacking out passages her uncle had written, which is basically content moderation, except the platform is 19th century Swedish correspondence, and the moderator is a woman with strong opinions about her family's legacy. She was thorough. She was not, it turns out, thorough enough. In 2016, Swedish conservators ran multispectral imaging over the letters. The technique reads ink layers separately, which means the blacked-out passages come back. What came back was intimate language. The word L, references that exceed conventional courtly correspondence by a measurable distance. You, meanwhile, had been writing to Fersen using the name Josephine, a coded alias, which is the 18th century equivalent of a burner account, except the stakes were considerably higher than getting ratioed. The night before the flight to Varennes, June 11, 1791, Fersen's diary records that he spent the night in the palace. The entry doesn't elaborate. Fersen's diary has learned by this point not to elaborate. What we know is that he was there. What we know is that the next morning he drove the royal family's Berlin carriage to Bondy, and then turned back, because a Swedish count accompanying the royal family across the border would have raised questions the plan couldn't absorb. He turned back at Bondy. The family continued without him. He never saw you again. His diary entry for October 16th, 1793 was destroyed by his descendants. The date is the execution. Whatever he wrote that day, the family decided the rest of the world didn't need it. None of this was known to the libelle writers, who didn't need it. They'd been writing Fersen into explicit scenes since roughly 1783. Because a handsome foreign man who visited regularly was exactly the kind of narrative hook that moved copies. The pamphlets didn't have access to multispectral imaging. They didn't need accurate source material. They had imagination, a printing press in Amsterdam, and a distribution network that could move paper across 3 borders in under a fortnight, which is basically next-day shipping, if next-day shipping destroyed a monarchy. Surrey. Fersen lived until 1810. He never married. A Stockholm mob killed him that June, blaming him wrongfully for poisoning the Swedish crown prince, a completely separate political disaster that found him anyway, because that was the kind of era it was. The diary entry for October 16, 1793 was already gone by then. His descendants made sure of it. The masquerade ball in 1774 takes about 4 minutes of actual conversation. 4 minutes, a costume that doesn't disguise anything important, and a Swedish military officer who doesn't immediately recognize the Dauphiné of France. The rest takes 19 years to finish. You arrange apartments for Fersen near Versailles, and in 1783 he moves in. The arrangement isn't announced and not concealed. He visits the palace at hours that are loosely supervised. He attends the Petit Trianon when invited, which is most of the time. He keeps a diary. The diary will eventually contain the line, on June 11th, 1791, that he spent the night in the palace. Whether that night was in your apartment specifically isn't recorded in the diary. The diary's silence on that question is consistent across decades. So is yours. The letters between you travel through Ambassador Mercy Argentos' diplomatic pouch, which is itself a kind of statement. You sign some of them with a false name, Josephine. Fersen addresses you in terms that exceed the conventions of courtly correspondence, which the conventions of courtly correspondence were never especially modest about to begin with. His niece, Charlotte de Koskull, will spend years after his death going through the letters with a pot of ink. She blackens whole passages. She is thorough. She isn't thorough enough. In 2016, Swedish conservators run the blacked-out pages under multispectral imaging. The ink disappears. The words come back. They've been there for 224 years under the redaction, which is the archival equivalent of finding a post-it note behind a framed picture and learning the previous tenant had feelings. The recovered passages include They include language that doesn't survive translation into anything that sounds like a diplomatic update. The libelle writers don't wait for 2016. They don't wait for evidence at all. By 1783, pamphlets are already circulating that describe the relationship in terms that require no recovered ink to understand. The pamphlets are wrong about most of the specific details, and possibly not entirely wrong about the broad shape of the thing. The broad shape of the thing isn't their actual concern. Their concern is circulation. Versions circulate from Amsterdam, from London, from print shops in Neuchâtel that specialise in material the French crown would very much prefer not to exist. The distribution network is basically a dark web marketplace before the internet, except the dark web is a series of booksellers' back rooms, and the content arrives wrapped in oilcloth and hidden inside barrels of legitimate merchandise. A pamphlet describing you and Fersen in scenes that wouldn't pass a basic plausibility review can be purchased for a few sous from a man near the Palais Royal who will absolutely deny knowing what you're talking about. You don't read them, or you do read them and don't say so. Either way, you know they exist. Mercy Argenteau mentions them in dispatches. Your mother mentioned them before she died in 1780, in the particular tone she reserved for things she'd warned you about and was now watching arrive on schedule. Fersen's visits to the palace continue. The hidden corridors that let Louis XVI reach his locksmithing workshop undetected also let other people move through the building without appearing in any official record of the evening. Versailles was built for spectacle, and it contains inside that spectacle an entire geography of unseen movement. The building knows where everyone is. The building doesn't write it down. By the late 1780s, France is approaching something that nobody wants to name out loud. The treasury is running on fumes and political debt. Your clothing budget peaked at over 120,000 livres in the early 80s, and the number hasn't been forgotten by anyone who knows it. Madame Deficit, the pamphlets call you. The pamphlets are doing a lot of work by now, filling in the spaces between what can be proven and what the reading public is already inclined to believe. Fersen keeps his apartments. He keeps his diary. He keeps, apparently, his counsel. The entry for June 11th, 1791 is the one that survives undestroyed. It's 4 words in French. His descendants removed the entry for October 16th, 1793 entirely. What it contained isn't recoverable by any imaging technology, because the page itself is gone. You don't get to know what he wrote on the day you died. The diary has opinions about what you're allowed to know. You write Fersen letters in your own hand, not dictated, not copied by a secretary, which is the only correspondence in the Royal Archive he treats with this level of personal care. After your death, his niece Charlotte de Coskell and her descendants spend decades blacking out specific passages with ink, cutting out other passages with scissors, and editing the surviving paragraphs into something her family considers presentable. In 2016, Swedish conservators aim multispectral imaging equipment at the blackened pages. The destroyed words come back. You called yourself at one point entirely his. The multispectral process works by reading light wavelengths the ink absorbs versus reflects, the same technology used to recover scorched medieval manuscripts and Pompeii-buried papyri. Charlotte's ink, applied in the mid-19th century with the confidence of someone who assumed the future would not invent infrared light, turns out to be wrong about the future, which is basically the equivalent of someone confidently covering a secret with a post-it note, then learning 200 years later that post-it notes are translucent under the right wavelength. The secret was always there. The equipment just hadn't arrived yet. What the conservators recover isn't a smoking gun. It's warmer than that, and in some ways harder to dismiss. Intimate pronouns, phrases that don't belong in diplomatic correspondence. The word L used in a context that suggests the letter was written about you to Fersen, or by Fersen about you, in terms no ambassador would put on paper. The letters don't read like a state document. They read like something Charlotte understood perfectly, which is why she reached for the ink. Fersen's side of the correspondence is similarly managed. His diary entry for October 16th, 1793, the day you're guillotined, doesn't exist. His descendants removed it. What remains is the June 11th, 1791 entry, which records that he spent the night inside Versailles. The June 11 entry survives because nobody could agree on what it proved. The October 16 entry apparently proved something everyone agreed on immediately. A Swedish nobleman who never married. A queen who signed letters. Josephine. An ink-blackened archive that takes 2 centuries and a spectrometer to read. The libelles had accused you of a dozen lovers, all fictional, named and illustrated and printed in multiple editions. The actual correspondence, the one that required a niece's decades of editorial effort to contain, gets recovered in a university conservation lab on a Tuesday afternoon in 2016. Nobody riots, there's a press release. The contrast is its own kind of verdict. The pamphlets moved fast, Amsterdam to Paris in under a week, passed hand to hand in back rooms, reissued whenever sales slowed, priced for maximum reach. The letters moved slowly through trusted couriers, signed with false names, kept in private hands, until those private hands decided to reach for a bottle of ink. The libelles were designed to be read by everyone. The letters were designed to be read by one person. Charlotte got there first, and she wasn't gentle about it. What you actually wrote, in full, you'll never entirely know. The conservators recovered passages. Not all of them. Some paragraphs were cut out with scissors, and scissors leave no ghost image for a spectrometer to find. Those sections are just gone. Rectangular absences in the paper where someone made a decision with a blade. The letters that remain are warmer than the official record wanted. The letters that don't remain were apparently warmer still. You have refused to speak to Cardinal Louis de Rohan for approximately 10 years, which is a fact widely known at court. He insulted your mother in a letter she intercepted in 1772, which she read aloud to her daughters, which she included in correspondence to Vienna, which guaranteed she would never let it go. You inherited the grudge. You enforce the grudge by silence. You don't greet the cardinal at any function. You don't respond to letters, and the cardinal occupies the social position of someone the Queen has placed in long-term cold storage. He wants out. The cardinal isn't a small man. He's the Grand Almoner of France, a prince of the church, a Rohan, which is one of the most powerful noble families in the country, a family whose motto is essentially, we are not quite kings. He has palaces, he has debts, he has the specific combination of status and insecurity that makes a man believe he is one good audience, with the Queen away from having everything he wants. He's wrong, but nobody tells him this. Rohan's title is Cardinal. Rohan's role at this court is rejected suitor. He has confused the two. At a reception in 1782, Rohan stands 6 feet to your left holding a glass of champagne for 19 consecutive minutes without raising it to his lips, in case you turn your head. You don't. This is where Jeanne de Valois Saint-Remy enters. She's a woman with an extremely useful last name. She claims descent from an illegitimate son of Henri II, and essentially nothing else. No money, no position, no real access to anyone powerful. What she has is a very good instinct for what desperate people need to hear, which is basically the same skill set as a LinkedIn influencer, except the deliverable is a cardinal and the product is a fraud. She tells the cardinal she knows the Queen. She implies she can help. She produces forged letters purportedly from Marie Antoinette, warming to the cardinal, softening, suggesting the cold storage might be ending. The cardinal reads them. He believes them. The handwriting is convincing enough, or he is desperate enough, or both. And with powerful men, the line between those two things is often not a line at all. The letters escalate. They become friendly, then warmer. Then one letter suggests that the cardinal might purchase, on the Queen's behalf, a diamond necklace that has been sitting unsold since Louis XV died before he could give it to his mistress. 647 diamonds, roughly 2,800 carats, 1,600,000 livres, which is approximately what it cost to build a warship, if you're looking for a contemporary reference and also a sense of scale. The cardinal agrees to be the go-between. He signs for it. But first, there's the garden scene, because this particular fraud has a garden scene. John arranges for a woman named Nicole Leguay d'Oliva, a Parisian prostitute who apparently resembles the Queen in low light, to wait in the Grove of Venus at Versailles after dark, in a white dress, with a single rose. The cardinal walks out to meet her. She hands him the rose. He takes it to mean the Queen has forgiven him. The grove is dark enough that he can't see her face clearly, or he doesn't want to, or he has been wanting this for so long that wanting is doing most of the work. He goes home convinced he's back in royal favour. Nicole Leguay d'Oliva gets paid and goes home. She's the only person in this entire story who leaves the garden with what she came for. The necklace is handed over in February 1785. It disappears almost immediately, dismantled in a London back room, the stones dispersed across the private collections of Europe. They've never been reassembled. 647 diamonds, and not one of them is still sitting next to another one. When the jewellers ask the Queen for the first payment instalment, she has no idea what they're talking about. The fraud unravels fast, the way frauds do once the money is gone. The cardinal is arrested at Versailles on August 15th, 1785, in full ceremonial vestments, on his way to say Mass, which is the kind of staging that makes even your enemies feel you've slightly overplayed it. You didn't order the public arrest. Louis XVI did. You will spend the next year wishing he hadn't. You're not in the Grove of Venus on the night of August 11th, 1784, but a prostitute named Nicole Leguay d'Oliva is, dressed in white, instructed to hand a single rose to whoever approaches. The cardinal approaches. He has been told by Jean de la Motte that you wish to forgive him in a private moment that can't be officially acknowledged, and the white-dressed figure in the garden is the unofficial acknowledgement. The exchange takes about 40 seconds. Nicole hands him the rose. He believes he has been forgiven. He hasn't. You don't know any of this is happening. Nicole Leguay d'Oliva, 23, blonde, the wig is also blonde, in case the lighting fails, is working. She's been paid, dressed and positioned in the dark, specifically because she's the right height. That's the full list of qualifications. She doesn't speak. She doesn't have to. The cardinal has done all the interpretive work himself, in advance, across several months of increasingly optimistic correspondence with Jean de la Motte, which is basically catfishing on Tinder, except the catfish is a sex worker, the simp is a cardinal, and the swipe ends with him wiring 1.6 million livres to a London jeweller. Cardinal Louis de Rohan isn't stupid. He's ambitious, which is different. He wants to believe he has the Queen's private affection because having the Queen's private affection would be extraordinarily useful for a man whose career has stalled. Jean de la Motte has provided exactly the evidence he requires. The forged letters are in your handwriting. Well, near enough. The figure in the garden is wearing white. The rose changes hands. The cardinal pockets the rose and walks back to his apartments, feeling restored. The necklace, 647 diamonds, 2,800 carats, originally commissioned for Louis XV's mistress, Madame du Barry, before Louis XV died inconveniently, is acquired on your behalf in February 1785. That's what the paperwork says. You've never seen the paperwork. The jewellers, Baumer and Bassenji, deliver it to the cardinal, who delivers it to Jean de la Motte's husband, who takes it to London, where it's dismantled in a back room, and the stones are sold individually. They're still scattered. The necklace has never been reassembled. Not a single complete diamond cluster from the original setting is known to exist. The arrest happens on August 15th, 1785, the Feast of the Assumption, the busiest ceremonial day in the Versailles calendar. The cardinal is in full pontifical vestments, preparing to celebrate Mass in the Hall of Mirrors, when he's summoned to Louis XV's private cabinet. 2,000 courtiers are waiting in the gallery. He's escorted out through them in vestments. That detail isn't an accident. Louis XVI insists on the public arrest. His advisers recommend discretion. He chooses the opposite. This is the decision that turns a private fraud into a national trial. The Parliament of Paris acquits the cardinal on May 31st, 1786. Jeanne de la Motte is convicted, publicly branded on both shoulders, with a V for voleuse, thief, and imprisoned at the Salpêtrière. She escapes to London in 1787 and publishes her memoirs, in which she explains that you orchestrated the entire scheme, that the cardinal was your lover, and that the necklace is in your private possession. None of this is true. The memoirs sell very well. Nicole Leguay d'Oliva is acquitted. The court finds she was an instrument, not a conspirator, which is accurate. She testifies that she stood in the dark for 40 seconds, handed a rose to a man she didn't know, and left. The trial transcript records her occupation without comment. She returns to Paris. Nobody writes a pamphlet about her. You're offered a diamond necklace, constructed by Baume and Bassangy, the court jewellers, who originally built it for Louis XV's mistress, and have been trying to find a buyer ever since the king died, before paying for it. The necklace contains 647 diamonds, weighs roughly 2,800 carats, and costs 1,600,000 livres, comparable to the construction cost of a large warship. You decline twice on grounds of expense. The jewellers don't stop trying. They can't afford to stop trying. The necklace is, as a financial object, the most aggressive item of jewellery in Europe. Baume has already begged on his knees. Literally, he knelt on the floor of a royal antechamber and wept at the Queen's feet, which is the jeweller equivalent of sending 17 follow-up emails. After being told the position has been filled, she told him to sell it elsewhere. He couldn't. Nobody else had 1,600,000 livres and the specific appetite for 647 diamonds, arranged in a single cascading object that weighs more than most small dogs. This is where Jeanne de Valois-Saint-Remy enters the picture. She's a minor noblewoman with a very large sense of entitlement and almost no actual money, which is a combination that tends to produce creative solutions. She tells Cardinal de Rohan, already desperate to regain royal favour, that she has the Queen's ear. She doesn't have the Queen's ear. She has a story about having the Queen's ear, which in Versailles in 1784 is nearly the same thing, because verifying anything requires access that almost nobody has. The scheme works in 3 stages. First, the cardinal begins secret correspondence with the Queen, letters actually written by Jean and her associates. Second, the Garden of Venus scene confirms the cardinal's belief that the Queen has forgiven him. Third, Ginny presents the cardinal with a document authorizing him to purchase the necklace on the Queen's behalf. The document is forged. The cardinal, a prince of the church and one of the most educated men in France, doesn't notice. The signature reads Marie Antoinette de France. Queens don't sign their surnames. He missed it. The necklace is handed over in February 1785. It disappears into a London back room within weeks, dismantled stone by stone, the diamonds sold individually to jewellers across the city. The 647 stones are still scattered. The necklace has never been reassembled. It exists now only as a description, in an invoice, and in roughly 40 years of subsequent historical argument. Meanwhile, Baume, still not paid, sends a note to the Queen in July 1785 referencing their arrangement. She has no idea what arrangement he means. She shows the note to her household. The note makes no sense. Then it makes terrible sense. Louis XVI, informed, makes the decision that will define the public narrative for the next 8 years He arrests Cardinal de Rohan in full ceremonial vestments, in public, at Versailles, on the Feast of the Assumption, in front of the entire court. The arrest is meant to be decisive. It's not decisive. The Parliament of Paris acquits the cardinal in May 1786. Jeanne de la Motte is branded with a V for voleuse, thief and imprisoned, but she escapes to London in 1787 and publishes memoirs blaming everything on the Queen. The memoirs sell extremely well, which is basically a true crime podcast that fabricates the murderer and names someone who was never in the room. Marie Antoinette isn't charged. She's not even formally implicated. But she's convicted in the pamphlet literature within months, and that verdict is the one that circulates. The real affair of the diamond necklace is a confidence scheme run by a broke aristocrat against a credulous cardinal. The version that survives in popular memory is a story about a queen who organised a jewel heist for personal profit, which she didn't do, couldn't have done, and declined to do twice before anyone asked her. The necklace never touched her neck. You insist on a public trial when the necklace fraud unravels because you calculate that a public verdict will vindicate you. The Parliament of Paris hears the case for nearly a year. The cardinal is acquitted on May 31st, 1786. The crowd outside the courthouse cheers, some of them paid, some of them not, the difference becoming harder to calculate as the year progresses. The cheering isn't for the cardinal's innocence, in any narrow legal sense. The cheering is for the Queen, having been publicly shown not to be in charge of the thing she was supposed to be in charge of. Jeanne de la Motte is branded with a V for thief. The crowd doesn't cheer that part. The branding happens in the courtyard of the Palais de Justice, which is a real place, where real legal consequences are delivered to real people. Jeanne screams and bites the executioner's assistant and has to be physically restrained. The V goes on her shoulder. She'll claim later that it was aimed at someone else entirely, that the whole affair was orchestrated from the top by the Queen against innocent parties. Nobody questions this claim who doesn't want to question it. The memoir she publishes in London in 1787 sells immediately, which is basically what happens when you put a Real Housewives confessional in a bookshop and tell people the Queen is the villain. The cardinal walks free, returns to his diocese at Strasbourg, and resumes being a cardinal. He's Cardinal de Rohan again. He was always Cardinal de Rohan. The distinction he briefly lost, the right to be taken seriously as a powerful churchman who controls significant land and income, is reinstated by judicial verdict, and he collects it on the way out. You're not restored to anything. Louis XVI dismisses de Rohan from his position as Grand Almoner of France, which is a court appointment rather than a church one, so the king can take it back. This is the only concrete consequence the palace extracts from the entire affair. One job title, returned. The necklace is still in pieces. The stones are still in London. The forger is branded and escaping. The cardinal is fine. A pamphlet appears within weeks, describing the verdict as proof that the Queen ran the scheme herself and let a cardinal take the fall. The logic doesn't hold if you examine it for more than 4 seconds, but the libelles aren't asking for 4 seconds. They're asking for the moment of reading, the flash of recognition, the satisfied nod. They're the original viral content. Short, outrageous, emotionally complete, requiring no prior knowledge and leaving no loose ends, which is more than can be said for the actual legal proceedings. Jeanne escapes from the Salpêtrière prison in 1787. The mechanics of her escape are disputed. She is in London by the time anyone notices she's gone, which is the kind of institutional embarrassment that gets quietly filed and not discussed. From London she writes more. The details in her memoirs are specific, lurid, and contradicted by documentary evidence, but the documents are in Versailles and the memoirs are in every bookshop in Europe. What the diamond necklace affair actually proves is narrow. A forger defrauded a jeweller. A cardinal wanted royal favour badly enough to meet a stranger in a garden at night, and asked no questions about why the meeting had to happen in the dark. The Queen declined a necklace. The Queen was never charged. What it establishes in the public imagination is something else entirely. It establishes that the Queen is the kind of person who could have done this. That's the thing that doesn't go away. Not the verdict, not the acquittal, not the V on Jean's shoulder. The could have. That word does more damage than any pamphlet title, and it costs nothing to print. You're given the Petit Trianon by Louis XVI in 1774, and you make a decision that becomes politically consequential. You restrict admittance. The traditional Versailles court has functioned for a century on the principle that any noble of sufficient rank may show up. The Petit Trianon doesn't honour this principle. Your entry list is short. It doesn't include several dozen people who consider themselves entitled to be on it. They notice. They tell their friends. The pamphlets that imagine what happens inside the Petit Trianon are written by people who have never been admitted to find out. The house itself is small by Versailles standards. 12 rooms, no state apartments, no gilded audience halls. Louis XV built it for his mistress Madame de Pompadour, who died before she could use it, which is the kind of architectural irony that Versailles specializes in. You receive it as a gift. You use it as a retreat. This makes you, to the excluded, suspicious. The Petit Trianon is not a palace. It's a smaller building with a notably exclusive invitation list, which at this court is the same thing as a fortress. The Hameau de la Reine, the little farm hamlet you have built on the grounds between 1783 and 1787, costs approximately 158,000 livres and features thatched cottages, a working mill, actual sheep, and a dairy where you can pretend to make cheese. The sheep are groomed. The dairy is decorated. The cheese is aspirational. It's basically a lifestyle brand, except the brand is rural simplicity and the budget is larger than most French villages see in a decade. None of this is secret. The costs are public record. The sheep are visible. And yet, because access requires your personal invitation, the imagination of the excluded fills the space that observation can't. The Polignac circle is in there. The Lamballe is in there. The pamphlets add detail that no guest ever reported, which is the advantage of writing fiction. You aren't constrained by what actually happened. The Duchess of Polignac is a specific problem, politically. Her family extracts between 500,000 and 700,000 livres annually from the royal treasury through positions, pensions and appointments tied to your favour. You're aware of this. You continue. The court notices the figure. The court doesn't keep this observation to itself. Madame Deficit circulates before the libelles do. It just doesn't have illustrations. A courtier who can't get through the Trianon door has two options. She can accept that the Queen prefers a smaller circle, or she can decide the smaller circle is a cover for something that wouldn't survive exposure to daylight. The second option is more interesting at dinner and considerably easier to distribute as a pamphlet. It's basically Yelp, except the review is 16 pages of explicit fiction and the reviewer was never inside the restaurant. Versions of this resentment existed before you arrived. Versailles runs on proximity to power, and proximity to power requires access, and access requires being on the list. You have shortened the list. More. Every shortened list in a court environment generates the same response. The people removed from it construct a narrative about why they had to be removed. That narrative at Versailles in 1783 gets printed in the Netherlands and smuggled back in the false bottoms of luggage trunks. The hidden corridors don't help. Versailles has them throughout. Passages that let Louis move to his locksmithing workshop without crossing public rooms, that let servants move without being seen, that let anyone move, in theory, without record. Nobody can verify who used them or when. The pamphlets verify it for them. The corridors that exist in the libelles are considerably busier than the corridors that exist in the palace. You spend Thursday evenings at the Trianon with the people you have chosen. The fire is smaller than a Versailles fire. The furniture is proportionate to a human body. Nobody is urinating behind a tapestry because there's actual plumbing. It's, by the standards of your daily life, quiet. It's the quietest thing you have, and it costs you more politically than the necklace, the poufs, and the Polignac pensions combined. Not because of what happens there, because of what doesn't happen, which is that nobody outside your list ever gets to know. You build the Hameau de la Reine on the Petit Trianon grounds between 1783 and 1787 at a cost of around 158,000 livres, and the result is a working farm. Real cows live there, real chickens lay real eggs, a real dairymaid produces real butter, and you and your closest friends occasionally produce some of the labour in deliberately rustic costume. The architectural style is faux medieval village. The agricultural reality is supervised theatre. You describe it as a retreat. The pamphlets describe it as a stage set for orgies. Neither description fully captures what's actually happening, which is mostly cheese-making. The buildings are 12 in total: a mill, a dovercote, a fisherman's house, a small tower, a dairy. The dairy is tiled in blue and white, Sèvres porcelain. The milking buckets have been monogrammed. This is the part that tends to get people. The rustic experience is fully staffed, exhaustively maintained, and the porcelain predates your arrival. Roughing it, Versailles style, is basically the same as a Soho farmhouse weekend, except the membership fee was paid entirely from the royal treasury, and nobody asked the treasury if it was interested. The Hameau de la Reine is not a farm. It's a farm-shaped opinion about leisure, with real cows attached. The cows are a specific breed, Swiss. Someone selected them for temperament. There's a keeper whose only documented job is the cows, and he takes this seriously in a way that most people around you don't take anything seriously. The chickens have a dedicated house with a small fence and an attendant who adjusts the fence whenever a chicken develops opinions about its location. The chickens develop opinions frequently. You wear a muslin dress when you visit. Simple, light, the colour of unbleached linen. It costs more than the dress it's pretending not to be. A lady-in-waiting follows at a slight distance, carrying a shawl in case you get cold, which you do, because the Hameau is open to weather in a way that Versailles isn't permitted to be. The shawl is also monogrammed. The monogramming budget is a separate line item that nobody discusses out loud. What you're actually doing here is resting. The lever starts at 8. The gaming runs past midnight. The ceremony is continuous and non-optional, and involves, at any given moment, approximately 40 people, either watching you, handing you something, or waiting to hand you something. The Hameau has a gate. The gate has a list. If you're not on the list, you don't see the cows. This is the part the excluded courtiers can't forgive. A dismissed baron mentions the gate to a friend. The friend mentions it to a pamphleteer in Paris with a rent problem and a printing contact in Amsterdam. 3 weeks later, there's a new libelle with a very specific interest in what happens behind the Hameau's walls after dark. The answer is nothing. A dairy maid goes home. The chickens go to sleep. The cows, whose keeper has adjusted their bedding, settle in with the quiet satisfaction of animals whose lives are genuinely better than most humans in France in 1785. The pamphlet doesn't mention the cows favourably. The Hameau costs 158,000 livres total. France is carrying a debt load that would eventually require the king to call the Estates General for the first time in 17 years. These two facts exist simultaneously and are not unrelated, though the Hameau alone didn't cause the deficit any more than a single Gwyneth Paltrow candle caused inflation. The Hameau is the visible thing. It stands still. It can be pointed at. That's enough. The mill wheel turns when there's enough water. There usually isn't. A groundskeeper adjusts the channel by hand. The wheel turns anyway, performing millness for an audience that isn't there. The butter, however, is real. Several accounts confirm the butter is excellent. This is the one fully uncontroversial thing anyone ever says about the Hameau de la Reine. The butter is excellent. Everything else is a pamphlet. You're very fond of the Duchess of Polignac, and the Duchess of Polignac is very fond of the royal treasury. The position of governess to the royal children is hers, so is the pension that comes with it. So are the appointments, sinecures and titles that have been distributed to her relatives, her in-laws, and several friends of the family who appear in the records mostly as line items. The annual extraction reaches between 500,000 and 700,000 livres. You haven't done the arithmetic. The pamphleteers have done the arithmetic. The Duchess herself is charming. That's the problem. She laughs easily, she doesn't perform the usual court stiffness, and she makes you feel like you're finally in a room with someone real. You've been surrounded by ceremony since age 14. A person who doesn't immediately reach for their rank is remarkable. Remarkable enough that you give her family a pension. C'est Vichy-Auvergne. And then another one. Her husband gets an appointment. Her brother-in-law gets a title. A cousin gets a position in the household that requires almost no duties, but generates a salary with impressive regularity. The Polignac family tree, cross-referenced with the royal accounts, reads like a LinkedIn org chart, where everyone in the company is related to the one person who went to school with the CEO. Comte Jules de Polignac, the Duchess's husband, holds a hereditary title and a position whose duties have never been written down. He attends 2 functions a year. The salary is annual. The Polignacs receive their pensions with the calm of people who have never once worried about whether the money will arrive. It always arrives. The Treasury has opinions about this. The Treasury is not consulted. None of this is secret. The court knows. The ambassadors write home about it. Marie Antoinette, who reports everything to your mother in Vienna, notes it with the careful diplomatic language of a man who is too polite to say the obvious thing, but wants the obvious thing understood. Your mother writes back from Vienna with the kind of warmth that contains a very sharp centre. She's been writing letters like that for years. You've been opening them with the same expression for years. The pamphlets don't use diplomatic language. By 1782, the Duchess of Polignac has become a fixture in the libel literature, not just as a recipient of royal funds, but as a figure in considerably more lurid arrangements. Les Godemiché Royal places her alongside the Princesse de Lamballe in scenes that are creative, detailed, and entirely fictional. The title translates roughly as The Royal Dildo. It runs in multiple editions. The pamphleteers are not subtle, but they're consistent. The pamphlet doesn't require a reader to believe it. It only requires a reader to repeat it. That's the whole mechanism, which is basically how a Reddit thread works, except the platform is a back-alley bookseller in Amsterdam, and the moderators have all been bribed or arrested. A court attendant with a grudge about an unpaid position passes the pamphlet to someone in a Parisian cafe. That person tells a friend the broad strokes. The broad strokes travel faster than the text. By the time the libelle reaches its 4th printing, the story it tells has already outrun it. You don't see most of these pamphlets directly. Someone sees to that. But you know they exist, because the court changes around them, the way people look at you, the jokes that stop being made when you enter a room, the silences that have a specific shape, a silence shaped like something printed. Something passed hand to hand in a city that's getting hungrier. The Duchess leaves Versailles in October 1789, 2 weeks after the Women's March brings a crowd to the palace gates with pikes and demands. She emigrates quietly and doesn't come back. You write her a letter before she goes. The letter is warm. You tell her to leave. You don't want her killed on your account. She survives. She dies in Vienna in 1793 of something unrelated to the revolution, in a bed, which in that year is the rarest possible outcome. You're extremely close to Marie-Thérèse Louise of Savoy-Carignan, the Princesse de Lamballe, and you appoint her superintendent of your household in 1775. The intensity of female friendship at this court is socially conventional and privately affectionate, and the difference between the two is something educated aristocrats can hold in their heads at the same time. The pamphlets don't. In Le Godemiche Royal, you appear in explicit lesbian scenarios with her by name, in additions of escalating specificity. She remains your friend through all of it. You don't discuss the pamphlets with her. There's nothing to discuss. Lamballe isn't a political operator. She isn't extracting pensions or placing relatives in appointments. She doesn't arrive with a family ledger and a list of cousins who'd make excellent tax collectors. She arrives at your apartments at 7 in the morning carrying a small dog she has acquired between dinner and dawn. She does this regularly. Nobody has ever asked her to stop, sets the dog on the rug, and begins describing the card game from the previous night without preamble. She's just there, at your side during the public meals, at your table during the private ones, standing near enough to hand you something when your hands are full, which at Versailles they always are. The pamphlets make this loyalty into evidence. That's the mechanic. Proximity becomes proof. Friendship becomes confession. You don't need to have done anything. You need only to have been seen standing next to someone in a palace that runs entirely on being seen. The Princesse de Lamballe is widowed at 19 and never remarries. The libelles find this significant. A widow who chooses to remain a widow and devotes her affection to a queen, that's not grief, according to the pamphlets. That's something else. The pamphlets always know what something else is. It's basically tabloid Twitter, except there's no character limit, and the publishers are operating out of Amsterdam, and your lawyer can't reach them. What Lamballe actually does during the revolution is stay. The Polignac circle emigrates. The courtiers disperse. Lamballe follows you to the Tuileries in October 1789, which isn't a comfortable choice. The Tuileries is cold, undersupplied, and surveilled. She stays anyway. She's questioned by revolutionary tribunals in 1792. She's asked to swear an oath against the monarchy and against you, specifically. She refuses. That's the whole story. She refuses, and 3 days later she's killed in the September massacres outside La Force prison. Her head is put on a pike. It's carried through the streets to the Temple prison, where you're being held, and lifted past the window. Contemporary accounts disagree on whether you see it. The disagreement doesn't make the fact less true. The head is there. The pike is there. The street is full of people who consider this an appropriate communication. You faint. Multiple witnesses say so. Nobody present considers that an overreaction. The libelles spent 13 years turning your friendship with Lamballe into a genre of fiction, escalating editions, named acts, illustrated versions in at least 2 print runs, which is the kind of publication history that suggests strong market demand. The Princesse de Lamballe's response to all of it was to follow you to an unheated palace, refuse an oath in front of a tribunal, and die outside a prison in September 1792. That's a documented record. It fits on one page. The pamphlets needed several illustrated volumes to say less. You learn about the parallel corridor system inside Versailles that allows movement between apartments without crossing the public rooms. Louis XVI uses these passages most frequently to reach his locksmithing workshop, which he keeps in a small private space and where he is genuinely good at making locks. The corridors are well known to courtiers and largely unknown to the general public, which means the public assumes the corridors are used at night by visitors who shouldn't be there. The locksmithing is real. The visitors are mostly not real. The corridors don't care which interpretation circulates. The passages aren't secret in any dramatic sense. They're service infrastructure, the same category as the backstairs in a large hotel, except the hotel has 10,000 residents, and the backstairs are how the king avoids his own dining room. Footmen use them. Ladies in waiting use them. Louis uses them to carry lock parts. He's currently apprenticing himself in his own palace to the master locksmith, François Gamin, from one floor to another, without being stopped by 17 people who want to discuss Bavaria. The corridor is not a corridor. It's a service tunnel with delusions of intrigue. The corridors are unremarkable. They become remarkable only at night, in the imagination of people who've never been inside them. The pamphlets have already done the architectural work. By the early 1780s, the libelles describe Versailles private spaces in specific, confident detail. The angle of the Queen's alcove, the sequence of antechambers, the timing of the guards' rounds. None of this is accurate. All of it sounds accurate. And a wall. The reader in a lion back room, paying a bookseller's assistant for a folded pamphlet, has no way to check the floor plan. The pamphlet has already checked it for him, incorrectly and with great conviction. The Petit Trianon makes this worse. Admittance is by personal invitation only, which is basically a VIP room policy, except the VIP room is a neoclassical pleasure palace, and the people not on the list are the entire French court. Louis XV built it. Marie Antoinette received it from Louis XVI in 1774 and used it as the one place where she could decide, for herself, who was allowed in. That decision, to have one space she controlled, reads to the excluded as a confession. The excluded are not subtle about their interpretation. A courtier not invited to Petit Trianon goes home and describes what must be happening there. His description circulates. It accumulates detail with each retelling, the way rumours do, which is to say it gets worse every time someone new touches it. By the time it reaches the pamphlet writers in Amsterdam and Neuchâtel, it has acquired specific names, positions, and schedules. The positions are fictional. The schedules are fictional. The names are real, which is the part that sticks. The hidden corridors and the private retreat work together in the public imagination as a single system. The corridor lets someone in. The Trianon keeps someone hidden. The Queen is at the centre of both, which means the Queen is guilty of whatever the pamphlet says she did, because the architecture confirms the opportunity existed. The architecture confirms no such thing. The architecture is just a building with a lot of doors. A guard named Monsieur Thierry stands his post at the corridor entrance nearest the Queen's apartments every night. He writes nothing remarkable in his reports. Nothing remarkable happens. He adjusts his coat. He listens. The corridor behind him is dark and quiet and completely empty, which is the least interesting version of events, and therefore the one that nobody repeats. You wake up on October 6, 1789, to find that several thousand Parisian market women have walked through the rain from Paris to Versailles, armed, demanding bread, and that they intend to march you back to Paris when they leave. You and Louis travel by carriage at the centre of the procession. The road is muddy. The march takes most of the day. The crowd's mood isn't cheerful, but it's not entirely hostile either. It's the mood of people who have decided where the king should live and have arranged the relocation themselves. You arrive at the Tuileries by evening. The Tuileries isn't Versailles. That's the first thing you notice. Versailles was built to express power outward, every corridor, every mirror, every fountain designed to remind you and everyone watching that the centre of France was exactly here. The Tuileries is a palace in the way that an airport hotel is a hotel. Functional, present. quietly depressing about the whole situation. The gardens are open to the public. You learn this immediately. Parisians walk past your windows, stop, and look in. You look out. This is now the arrangement. It's basically living in a very ornate fishbowl, except the fish is the Queen of France, and the viewers don't particularly like the fish anymore. The women who walked from Paris to Versailles are called the October women now, or the fish market women, because many of them were market traders and fishwives, the kind of women who got up before dawn, handled things most people wouldn't touch, and had opinions they didn't soften for anyone. One of them, a fishmonger named Rainier, the name is real, the irony was never quite lost on anyone, walks at the front carrying a sword nearly as tall as she is, and stops only to redistribute bread to the women behind her. They'd marched 12 miles in the rain with pikes and a cannon. Some of them had forced their way into the palace the night before and made it as far as your antechamber before the guards pushed them back. 2 of your bodyguards didn't survive the night. You appeared on the balcony in the morning at their demand, alone first, then with the children, and the crowd's noise shifted, not to warmth, exactly, but to something that paused. Louis agrees to return to Paris the same morning. He doesn't take long to decide. The cannon is visible from most windows. The libelles take note of the march immediately. Within weeks, pamphlets are reframing it. The women didn't come because bread cost more than a day's wages and the harvest had failed. They came, according to the pamphlets, because the Queen had said something. The Let Them Eat cake line is already in circulation, attached to your name, almost certainly borrowed from an older anecdote about a different princess entirely. It doesn't matter. The attribution has weight now. It fits the character the pamphlets have spent a decade constructing, the Austrian woman who doesn't understand hunger because she's never considered it relevant. You haven't said it. You've been sending personal funds to relief efforts since 1788. The receipts exist. They're in Vienna's house, Hof- und Staatsarchiv, alongside your mother's letters, which is where things that are true about you tend to end up. In archives, under multispectral imaging, waiting. The pamphlets are in the street. The Tuileries has no Petit Trianon, no Hameau, no private garden you can walk through without being watched. The corridors here don't lead anywhere useful. There's no locksmith workshop, no Rose Batin arriving with new sketches, no lever ceremony with its complicated hierarchy of chemise delivery. The ritual that structured your mornings for 19 years is gone. What replaces it smaller, quieter, and considerably harder to describe? You get dressed. People watch. The day begins. Somewhere in Paris, a printer is setting type for the next edition of something with your name in the title. He's done this before. He'll do it again. The edition sells out by afternoon, which is the same thing it always does, because the market for invented catastrophe hasn't softened just because the real catastrophe has arrived. You receive Fersen at the Tuileries during 1791, which is technically illegal in several different ways. He uses a false passport. He arrives at unsupervised hours. The servants who notice the visits don't always write them down, and some of the ones who do write them down are reporting to people who don't yet know what to do with the information. The visits are not romantic in any straightforward sense by this point. They're operational. He is helping you plan an escape. You sign your letters, Josephine. He signs his Rignon. The codes are simple. The codes get broken later. The Tuileries isn't Versailles. Versailles had corridors built specifically so that people could disappear. The Tuileries has windows facing the street, and the street has opinions. Parisians stop outside and watch your windows the way people today watch a live court hearing on their phones, not expecting to understand everything, but certain that something important is about to happen, and not wanting to miss it when it does. You're the content now. You don't have a choice about that. Fersen's false passport lists him as a Swedish merchant. He uses a false passport. The passport is in the name of a Russian merchant, who does not exist, which is the kind of detail Fersen finds romantic and the Russian merchant would find inconvenient. He uses at least 3 different names across his visits. The guards at the gate check the name on the paper, not the face above it, which is either a catastrophic security failure or a professional courtesy, and it's genuinely impossible to know which. He comes in through service entrances. He leaves before light. 224 years later, Swedish conservators run multispectral imaging over his letters and find passages his niece had blacked out with ink in the 1800s, which is basically the document equivalent of a family member deleting someone's browser history and not doing it thoroughly enough. The passages contain the word L. They contain language that exceeds diplomatic correspondence by some margin. You write to him in the third person when you mean yourself. The letters go through multiple hands before they arrive. You refer to your own situation as though describing a stranger, which after 2 years at the Tuileries isn't entirely inaccurate. The escape plan has a name by now. It has a route. It has a heavy, dark-painted Berlin carriage built specifically for the journey, fitted with a green silk interior and a hidden compartment for documents, which is the kind of carriage that says we are absolutely not fleeing in the same way that a man wearing a hat indoors in summer is absolutely not trying to be unrecognized. Fersen himself will drive the Berline as far as Bondy. That's the plan. The plan is meticulous. The plan will last until approximately Varennes en Argonne, at which point a postmaster recognizes Louis XVI from his face on a coin, and the plan becomes something else entirely. But that's June. In the months before June, the visits continue. Fersen sits in rooms that servants have mostly vacated and talks to you about roads, about timing, about which royalist officers can be trusted at which checkpoints. The information is dense. The stakes are not abstract. Louis XVI has already been suspended once. The assembly is running out of patience, in the way that institutions run out of patience, slowly, then completely. His diary entry for October 16th, 1793, was destroyed by his descendants. Not lost, not misfiled, destroyed. Nobody preserved that one. You leave Paris on the night of June 20th, 1791, in a custom carriage called a berline that Fersen has personally designed, financed, and is currently driving. He drives you as far as Bondy, and then turns back, because his Swedish identity makes his continued presence in the carriage a security risk. The berline is large, slow, and recognizable. Louis insists on stops you don't have time for. By the time the carriage reaches Saint-Ménard, the postmaster Drouet has recognized the king from the silhouette on a coin. He rides ahead. The berline stops at Varennes. The escape had been months in the planning. Fersen had sourced relay horses, mapped routes, coordinated contacts in Chalons and Pont de Somvels, and commissioned the berline himself, a carriage large enough for a family of 5 travelling incognito, which is basically the opposite of what incognito means. It's upholstered, well-provisioned, and travelling at the pace of a furniture delivery. Every minute the carriage spends on the road is another minute a postmaster can squint at a coin. Draft rides to Varennes and finds the town's National Guard before the berline arrives. There's a brief argument about authority and jurisdiction and who exactly has the right to arrest the King of France on a public road. The argument doesn't take long. You're stopped at a house belonging to a grocer named Sauce, not a chateau, not a garrison, a grocery. The king is recognized. He admits who he is. That's the moment. Not the arrest, not the ride back, but that admission, that brief pause where Louis XVI, who has spent his entire adult life being formally announced into every room he enters, decides to confirm it voluntarily. He confirms it. The grocer writes it down. You spend the night in the grocer's upper rooms while a crowd gathers outside. The children are asleep. Louis eats something. The crowd isn't hostile, exactly. It's confused, and confusion in 1791 tends to resolve in the direction of whichever official arrives fastest. 3 commissioners from the National Assembly arrive by morning and present the order for your return. The ride back to Paris takes 3.5 days. The assembly has issued a decree. No one along the route is to speak to you, address you, or acknowledge you in any way. Crowds line the road in silence. Men keep their hats on when the carriage passes, which in 18th century France is the specific gesture that means we don't recognize your authority, which is basically a 1-star review left in public in front of everyone for 70 miles. The heat is considerable. The carriage isn't designed for comfort in this direction. Fersen, back in Brussels by now, doesn't know how it ended for another 2 days. His diary entry is very short. His niece left that one intact. You arrive back at the Tuileries on June 25th. The crowds are large and quiet. You're escorted inside. The assembly suspends the king's constitutional functions while it decides what to do next, which is the government's version of putting something in a drawer and not opening it for a while. Louis XVI is briefly a king with no actual role, in a palace that's now functionally a prison, in a city that has just watched him try to leave. The flight to Varennes doesn't end the monarchy immediately. It just removes any remaining doubt about whether the monarchy is something France still wants. You're imprisoned at the Temple in September 1792, and the Princesse de Lamballe is held in a separate prison called La Force. On September 3rd, a revolutionary mob removes her from her cell, walks her in front of a makeshift tribunal, asks her to swear an oath against the monarchy, and kills her when she refuses. They cut off her head. They put it on a pike. They walk the pike past the windows of your prison and tilt it upward so you can see. Accounts vary on whether you saw it. Accounts agree on what was outside the window. Marie-Louise de Savoie-Carignan, Princess de Lamballe, had been your closest friend since the mid-1770s. She was the kind of friend who showed up at 7 in the morning and didn't leave until midnight, and somehow this was not annoying. She was superintendent of your household, which is a title that sounds administrative until you understand it, meant she organized your days, managed your social calendar, and sat beside you at things no one else could be made to attend. She'd voluntarily returned from exile in England to be with you after the August insurrection. She came back. That detail doesn't resolve neatly. The September massacres ran from September 2nd through the 7th. Revolutionary crowds moved through Paris prisons, La Force, the Abbaye, the Carmes, pulling out prisoners and improvising tribunals in the courtyards. The charge was counter-revolutionary sympathy. The process was fast. The outcome wasn't really in question. Somewhere between 1,100 and 1,400 people died across 6 days, which is basically a Wikipedia disambiguation page that nobody wants to be on. Lamball's tribunal lasted minutes. She wouldn't swear the oath. She may not have fully understood what refusing meant, or she may have understood exactly what it meant. Either way, she said no. Her head was mounted on a pike and carried through the streets of Paris, then lifted outside the temple windows. Some accounts say her hair had been dressed beforehand, which either means the crowd took time to style it as a taunt, or means something worse about what kind of theatre this was. Some accounts say her face was still recognizable. The pike-bearers reportedly shouted to you to look. Whether you did or fainted is the part the sources can't agree on. What they don't dispute is the shouting. What they don't dispute is the pike. The temple itself was a medieval fortress tower that the revolutionary government was using as a detention facility because it apparently felt that if you're going to imprison a royal family, you should do it somewhere that communicates the correct architectural attitude. Your rooms were on the upper floors. The windows were not small. The street below was not far. A guard named Jacques Lepêtre, stationed at the temple, later recalled that after the incident you didn't speak for a long time. He recorded this in a memoir he published in 1817, the kind of memoir that takes 25 years to admit you witnessed something and another decade to figure out what to call it. That's the kind of detail that doesn't require elaboration and doesn't get any. The libelles had spent 15 years building a fictional version of you and Lamballe together, inventing a relationship, illustrating it, printing it in multiple editions, selling it in Amsterdam. The pamphlets made her a character, in a story about your depravity. The mob outside the window made her a prop in a story about your punishment. In both versions, she's the instrument and you're the subject. In neither version is she a person who came back from England when she didn't have to. You have been in the temple since August 13th. You'll be here until August 2nd of the following year, when you'll be transferred alone to the conciergerie. Louis is still alive in September 1792. The children are still here. The guards change every few hours, and none of them are supposed to speak to you directly, though some do anyway, quietly, when their supervisor isn't watching. The tower is cold. It's September, and it's already cold. You're moved to the conciergerie on August 2nd, 1793, into a cell of approximately 12 square meters. There's a wooden cot, a thin straw mattress, a small table, and a wooden screen. Behind the screen, a chamber pot. In front of the screen, 2 guards who are present at all times, including when you use the chamber pot. Fruel, the black widow's dress you wear was your own, and you mend it yourself when it begins to fray. Your hair has gone white over the course of several months. You're 37 years old. The guards are paid to watch. The cell is below the waterline of the Seine. You can hear the river. It doesn't care. The walls sweat with a particular enthusiasm that suggests they've been doing this since long before you arrived, and they'll keep doing it long after. The straw mattress has opinions about posture that you learn to negotiate around 2 o'clock every morning. The wooden screen isn't a door. It doesn't close. It suggests a boundary, the way a velvet rope at a restaurant suggests exclusivity, without actually providing it. The screen is not a screen. It's a wooden suggestion, set at a height that doesn't reach the floor and doesn't reach the ceiling. There was a time, not very long ago, when the morning ritual of being dressed required 17 ladies, a rank order hand-off system for your chemise, and a small internal war if a duchess entered the room mid-sleeve. Now there's a screen, and 2 men who look up. The morning guard is named Honoré Larivière. He's 26. He sits on a wooden stool with his musket across his knees and reads a 1-sheet Republican newspaper while you eat your breakfast. He never looks up. He's been told not to. He follows the instruction with the unhurried discipline of a man who would rather be elsewhere. You've had no news of your son since July 3rd, when they removed Louis Charles to a separate cell. He's 8 years old. You know the cell is nearby because the building isn't large. You don't know what they're telling him about you. You don't ask because there's no one to ask, and because asking has a way of becoming an answer you weren't ready for. A woman named Rosalie Lamollet brings your meals. She's the prison servant. She makes a point of doing this carefully. The broth hot when hot is possible, the bread positioned so it doesn't immediately touch the damp surface of the table. This is, in the context of 1793, a significant act of kindness. Rosalie doesn't announce it as such. She sets the bowl down. She leaves. The trial is scheduled. You know it's scheduled because the building itself seems to know. Guards shift, voices lower, footsteps change register in the corridor. The conciergerie has a way of communicating upcoming events through its own architecture, the way a dentist's waiting room communicates through the particular quality of its silence. October 14th. You're brought into the courtroom after 2 nights of almost no sleep. The charges are read: treason, counter-revolutionary conspiracy, squandering the treasury. Then Jacques-Louis Hébert, the journalist who ran the pamphlet Père Duchesne, which is basically the comment section of a particularly unhinged Reddit thread, except it's 1793, and it decides if you live, stands up and accuses you of sexually abusing your 8-year-old son. You're quiet for a moment, then you turn to the women in the gallery. And you say, nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge laid against a mother. I appeal to all mothers present. The gallery reacts. Robespierre, who has spent 4 years building the machinery that brought you here, reportedly says afterward that Hébert's accusation was a mistake. The pamphlets had spent 14 years inventing things. This one went somewhere that even the revolution found uncomfortable. It didn't save you, but it landed. The verdict takes until 4 in the morning on October 15th. Guilty. Sentence: death. You return to the cell. Rosalie helps you change into a white dress. Your hands are bound behind your back. You're 37 years old and your hair is white and the dress is plain, which would have been unthinkable 20 years ago when a single gown cost 3 years of a craftsman's wages, and Rose Bertin had opinions about the sleeve. The tumbril faces backward. You ride through Paris, sitting that way, facing where you've been, not where you're going. At the scaffold, you step on the executioner's foot. You say, "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur, I didn't do it on purpose." He doesn't respond. The crowd is loud. The screen behind the chamber pot was the last private thing. You're tried before the Revolutionary Tribunal on October 14th and 15th, 1793, and the prosecutor saves the worst charge for the second day. Jacques-René Hebert has interviewed your 8-year-old son in isolation over a period of months and produced testimony accusing you of incest with him. The charge is read aloud. You're asked to respond. You don't respond at first. When pressed, you turn to the gallery and address the women specifically. Nature itself, you say, refuses to respond to such a charge laid against a mother. The gallery weeps. Even Robespierre will later describe the charge as a strategic error. Hebert isn't a careful man. He's the editor of a newspaper called Le Père Duchesne, which is basically TMZ if TMZ ran on pure fury and printed every accusation as established fact. And his strategy at the trial is to open every wound the libelles opened over the previous decade and make each one official on the record. The incest charge is the last wound. It's also the one that doesn't land. The rest of the charges do. Sending money to Austria, conspiring against the Republic, orchestrating the flight to Versailles. These are read in sequence by men who've already decided the outcome, in a room that smells of tallow candles and unwashed wool. You answer each one. You've been awake since before the sun rose. Your hair is white. It turned white during the imprisonment. Multiple witnesses noted it. Guards, attendants, the women who were briefly permitted near you. Not gradually, noticeably. You're 37 years old, and you look like a woman twice that, which is what 11 months in a 12-square-meter room with 2 guards watching you at all times will do. The guards watched you sleep. They watched you use the chamber pot behind its small wooden screen. The screen didn't fully cover the view. Nobody pretended this was accidental. The trial runs 2 days, which is longer than most revolutionary tribunal proceedings got. Most defendants were in and out in under an hour, which is less time than it takes to get through TSA pre-check and considerably less time than it takes to be judged fairly. You get 2 days. 40 witnesses are called. The verdict was not in doubt. A woman in the gallery, named Citizeness Milot, later described your face during Hebert's accusation. Still, she said, completely still. And then you turned, and you spoke. And the room changed temperature in a way she couldn't explain. Louis Charles, your son, is 8. He's being held separately in the tower. And he won't survive the imprisonment. He'll die in June 1795 of tuberculosis and neglect at 10 years old, still inside the temple. But that's 2 years away. Right now he's 8, and someone has spent months teaching him what to say, and he's said it, and the words are now in the official record of the French Republic. In 2000, a DNA test on a preserved lock of Louis Charles' hair confirmed your biological relationship to him. The result sat in a scientific journal and was reported matter-of-factly, the way confirmation of something everyone with a functioning mind already understood tends to get reported. The verdict is guilty. The sentence is death. You're returned to the conciergerie. A priest is offered. You write a letter to your sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, that never reaches her. It's intercepted and kept. In it you say you're not afraid, which may or may not be true, and that you're thinking of your children, which is certainly true, and that you forgive everyone who caused your death, which is the kind of sentence that takes considerable composure to write in the small hours of October 16th, with a candle burning down and the guards watching from the corner. You don't sleep much. By 4 in the morning, you're writing. By 10, you're dressed. The executioner cuts your hair himself. The tumbrel is open-sided, which is a deliberate choice. The route to the guillotine is long, and the crowds are thick, and the Republic wants you seen. You ride backward. The streets are loud. You step off the cart at the Place de la Révolution, and walk to the scaffold, and you step on the executioner's foot, and you say, "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur, I didn't do it on purpose." Those are your last words. An apology. Automatic, reflexive, 14 years of Versailles court manners, firing one final time in a place with no use for them. You ride to the Place de la Révolution on October 16th, 1793, in an open tumbrel, seated backward, hands bound behind your back. Your hair has been cropped close to the neck for the blade. The crowd lines the route in silence. The crowd lines the route in silence. You ascend the scaffold steps without assistance. Near the top, you accidentally step on the executioner's foot. You apologize. "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur." You say, "Je ne l'ai pas fait exprès." I didn't do it on purpose. These are the last words anyone records you saying. They're spoken to the man who is about to kill you. They're spoken with the manners you were raised to use. The manners were installed early. A 14-year-old at the Rhine border, surrendering her dog, her dresses, her attendants, her language, dressed in French clothes, before she'd crossed into France. The same ceremony that stripped her of everything Austrian handed her a replacement identity on a silver tray. Not her silver tray? France's silver tray. She's been performing France ever since, and she performs it to the end, on a scaffold, to a man holding a blade. You've seen worse audiences. Her body goes into a quicklime pit at the Madeleine Cemetery. No coffin, no marker. The revolutionary government's position is that she doesn't require one. She's 37 years old. She arrived at Versailles at 14. That's 23 years of being the most scrutinized woman in Europe, which is basically being main character on a reality show, where the producers also control the justice system, and the guillotine is the series finale. The cell at the conciergerie was 12 square meters. 2 guards stationed inside it at all times, even when she was behind the chamber pot screen. She'd come from a palace with 10,000 residents and no indoor plumbing, which means the guards are not actually an upgrade in privacy. They're just more official about it. Her hair turned white during the imprisonment. Multiple people who saw her noted it. She was 36 when it happened. The trial portrait, drawn in secret by a courtier, shows a woman who looks 60, sitting straight, hands folded, looking at nothing in particular. The posture is impeccable. She'd been trained. The execution is carried out. The body is recovered in 1815, 22 years later, by the restored Bourbon government, and reinterred at the Basilica of Saint-Denis alongside Louis XVI. The quicklime had done its work thoroughly. What's recovered is fragments. The DNA recovered in 2000 from a lock of Louis Charles' hair, a lock that had passed through several European archives, and a Belgian collector's estate confirmed her as his biological mother. The libelles had spent 15 years attributing his paternity to other men. The hair disagreed. Axel von Fersen's diary entry for October 16, 1793 was destroyed by his descendants. What he wrote about that day, nobody knows. His niece had opinions about what should survive. The multispectral imaging in 2016 recovered the letters, but not the diary. Some things stay gone. Fersen himself died in June 1810, beaten by a Stockholm mob who blamed him for poisoning the Swedish crown prince. He hadn't. He was pulled from his carriage in full diplomatic uniform and killed in the street. He never married. The Swedish National Archives still hold the recovered letters, the ones his niece blacked out, the ones that came back under light. They're filed under correspondence. The category doesn't quite cover it. What the libelle said she was, and what she was, don't overlap much. The pamphlets wanted a monster, spendthrift, lewd, foreign, insatiable, because a monster is easier than the thing she actually was, which is a teenager, married into an institution that had already decided what her story would be, and a woman who spent 23 years trying to revise it, and couldn't. The manners held all the way to the scaffold. The blade didn't care about the manners. It rarely does. You spent the night losing your dog at the Rhine, standing naked while princesses argued over a chemise, wearing a model frigate in your hair, and eventually stepping on a man's shoe on the way to the guillotine. You apologized for the shoe. You did not apologize for the necklace, because the necklace was never yours. The pamphlets that named you, illustrated you, sold you for a few sous on Paris street corners, those don't matter tonight. The people who do are the ones who didn't get printed, the dressmakers who built 3-foot poufs by hand, the laundresses who handled your linen, the valet who carried the chamber pot down the marble stairs at 2 a.m. without waking anyone important. They had names. The pamphlets just didn't bother. Let your shoulders drop. Let the candles in the hall of mirrors go out, one by one, until the corridor is just dark and quiet, and yours. Your necklace is exactly where you left it. The tumbril is not coming. Whatever you stepped on the way to bed, completely forgiven. Sleep well.